Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight of speaking with Matthew Stanley. I always look forward to these conversations. He's extremely insightful, a wonderful writer. Samsara Diagnostics, the Substack, his work, his YouTube. It's this just always gain a lot out of his thinking. I've always really it's a when the Substack shows up, it's an event, and his books are amazing. Everyone do pick up Ideology and Christian Freedom. I think this is a wonderful book. I think his poetry is wonderful, and I think this book also points to the class that Matthew Stanley is going to be teaching. The Violence of Care. It's coming up, and we're going to talk about some of it and some of the ideas, and he can tell you more. And Matthew Stanley, thank you for being here. It is always a delight, sir.
Dan, thanks. It's been way too long since we've talked. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. You're somebody that I look up to, admire, and learn a lot from. So it's always great to have an extended conversation.
Well, thank you. Well, that means a lot, Matthew Stanley. I appreciate it, and I'm always amazed at the insights and work that you bring to the table. And like I said, I've been writing so much on your work in The Belonging Again, so I've learned a lot from you, and I appreciate it, sir. And so, Matthew Stanley, if I were to ask you about your upcoming class, what would you say? And maybe some just basic information about when it starts, so people can get that out the gate, and then some of the ideas.
Yeah, I've been on here before. I suspect people might not know who I am. I'm Matthew Stanley. I write at Samsara Diagnostics. I also publish at Samsara Media on Substack. I'm in this year for 2025. I'm working on a kind of a long-term research project that I that has been sort of in the works for a long time. It's kind of been this inchoate perspective that I've had that I was never able to articulate, but I would say around August, September of last year, I kind of finally put out a short little piece where I tried to kind of nail it down and got some good response. Actually went on Theory Underground's one of their M Stews and talked with Dave McCarricker about it. So this research project is, I'm calling it Critical Bureaucratic Studies. Very boring name for it. I'm in my own mind, I'm calling it Molech theory, which I can talk about that another time. Um, but I don't want to scare normies away. So right now it's Critical Bureaucratic Studies. Um, and I'm teaching a short 4 week seminar as kind of like a mini pilot on this idea because I'm going to develop it into a larger course, maybe 11 weeks. I'm hoping to launch later in the year. But this 4 week seminar is going to be with a wonderful community called Incite Seminars that I really enjoy being a part of. And I've taught there in the past, and it's just a really interesting collective of people from a variety of different backgrounds. A lot of kind of anarchism, Buddhism, artists. It's just pretty eclectic. And so I'm looking to teach this course called The Violence of Care, a critical inquiry into bureaucratic power. And what I'm looking at is this shift that's taken place in governance within the past 300 years that I think a number of theorists in the 20th century are trying to draw out. And it's this shift where power now comes in this form of care, where the structures care about you, about your health, about your wealth, about your prosperity, and power is now exercised in the name of your good, your personal good, your the communal good, all of these sort of things. Um, so the first lecture is going to be on Foucault, who's very much a guiding theorist for me, and his shift between uh, societies of discipline and societies of security. This movement from the right over death to the power over life.
Mm.
So I'm going to be talking about that shift, and that I think that's a perspective that's lacking from a lot of conversations. There's a lot of talk about capitalism, and I don't think that the perspective of, hey, actually, there's this novel form of power in the modern age that's exercised through governance, through the state, through bureaucracy, that there's something unique about this form of power, and that it's actually a supplement of capitalism, is kind of the long-term argument that I'm wanting to make.
Mm.
And which you see a lot in the left is a tendency to be, well, we need more of the state. The state is sort of not capitalism. the state is, say, the will of the people, it's for the good. It's kind of portrayed as the good guy. Um, I liked Dave McCarricker kind of has this like I've said like mommy state and daddy capital, and he's kind of played on this like bad divorce sort of vision where like now daddy capital and mommy state are divorced, and you're the kid caught in the middle, and so you've got broken custody, and they're turning you against each other and playing you off of each other. But let's be honest, sometimes they're still doing it. So like there's this toxic dynamic where they're both trying to turn you against each other, but really they're sort of on the same team in the long run. And so I want to bring this perspective of how does bureaucratic power infiltrate and supplement capitalism? Because I think that Foucault's work it poses this fundamental question that I've been interested in, and I think you see it in my book. I'm realizing there's these strains in my book that I'm pulling out, there was a lot of things bundled together, and I sensed it when I was writing the book, but I knew I needed to write it. So, but Foucault fundamentally poses the question of, is liberation really liberating under capitalism?
Mm.
And I think that what Foucault is digging up is that liberation is no longer works under capitalism in the way that it used to. So part of what capitalism is doing, and this is his critique of psychoanalysis, is that capitalism and our societies of security, what they do is they play on this older thing of, oh, we are still in a disciplinary society where the sovereign imposes his will through the exercise of law, and liberation is for you to throw off the law and to act on your desires. And that plays on uh, you think that you're in an older model of power, but you're actually operating under a new model of power where the liberation of desire is actually giving power what it wants. And because power wants to draw out and understand the forces at work in life so that it can mold, shape, it can market, it can provide goods and services, it can adjust its interventions and approaches. So this is Foucault's one of his concerns with psychotherapy is that by talking about yourself, you're sort of creating this grist for the mill for bureaucracy to understand you, to categorize you, to diagnose you, to intervene in your life, to, all ostensibly for your good because they care about you. So this question of freedom under capitalism, I think, is a central question that Foucault's asking, and I think it's why many of his sort of leftist compatriots became uncomfortable with him, because in the left today, there's very much an emphasis on the liberation of desire, the total affirmation of self, just the proliferation of identity. And Foucault early on was beginning to see, hey, maybe that's not as liberating as you think it is. And he began to kind of become this black sheep in leftist circles.
Yeah. That was absolutely brilliant. So everyone, you now know you need to sign up for the class because that's pointing at exactly some of the major blind spots in modern thought. I am a big fan of everything you just said. Absolutely fantastic. A few things, we tend to be trapped between, is it Huxley or is it Orwell? Postman at the beginning of Amusing Ourselves to Death. I agree, it's more Huxley than it is Orwell, but both of those actually are taking away from other categories of people like Kafka or Ivan Illich's Disablement, or the other people, Buchanan, the people that you are mentioning. Because, as I spoke with Pavio about, the critical thing to Kafka novels, especially, for example, Joseph K., is that he internalizes his subjugation, which brings a line out of your book. I love this line. On page 85, the mechanisms of control must become internalized in such a way that the person becomes auto-regulating and complicit in their own subjugation. That is a beautiful sentence. That is exactly right. And you see, the key to that is meaning that no one has to threaten you to do something. You instead internalize a certain behavior that makes you do what they want you to say or they want you to do without them having to force it upon you, right? And that's a much more powerful form of control because, as we've spoken about before, if someone is directly threatening you, it's actually a weak strategy because I can target it, I can see it, and I know my obstacle. But if my subjugation is invisible, I don't know who the bad guy is per se, right? I can't target anyone. And you see that again in like the trial by Kafka, because he's told he's broken this crime. He's not told who he is, but he himself chooses to go deeper into it and to make his situation worse. He internalizes that and then acts in a manner. And then the final scene that's so tremendous is before he gets stabbed, the guards turn the knife to him as if he's supposed to stab himself, right? Like, oh, this is your last act, right? And Kafka, I think, is beautifully the novelist of the kind of subjugation that you're pointing to. And of course, Kafka's, what is he always trapped in? The bureaucrat, the great gigantuous bureaucracy. So for me, a lot of people talk about Orwell and Huxley. I like the third in a way is Kafka for me. And Kafka, and there are others, obviously, but if I'm just speaking those three. And of course, if we speak about Ivan Illich's very important notion of disablement, in the subjugation of power, you are also disabled to recognize yourself as subjugated. And I think you're pointing to that with, I'm not being subjugated, I'm being cared for. I'm being taken care for. I'm being shown the efficient and best way to do things. I'm being shown how to realize my potential, how to be my fuller self. Oh, these things are not subjugations. These are expressions of my latent potential that are coming out in a deep way. Well, yeah, but it's kind of framed in a way that's advantageous to the structure, right? And you're disabled from seeing beyond that, right? It makes me think of a line that I use all the time because I do like it, out of Cosetti's at the end of Waiting for Barbarians, where he says, I feel like I've been looking at something my entire life and I can't see it. And I think that's kind of the ultimate accomplishment of power, to be right in front of you your entire life and you're not able to see it, because the power works in a way to where you can't see it, right? Because the very means by which you become intelligible to the society, intelligible to yourself, and intelligible to others actually is that of which is blinding you in the very act of seeing the world according to that horizon of intelligibility. And I think it's very insightful on what you're saying, and then feel free to respond to anything at all, what you're saying on Foucault. I think that's exactly right. I've always respected that about Foucault. He did not stay in the box that he was, could have been famous for, could have been, the great thinker. He kind of looked at his own work and went, there's something here that's got to be explored a little more, right? This idea of liberation doesn't seem to quite be liberation. And he's been rejected for that. But I've actually always respected Foucault for taking that move. And I think it's very wise to start with Foucault. And then the last thing I'll say is sometimes I think about this problem. Oh, and Monarch theory is great. That's magnificent. So I like that because it is, as we talked about before, if all of this is tied to some sort of framing of rationality to lead itself to the Monarch sacrifice, like that famous Alexander example, then yeah, it's really good. But Koratani, and I do like how he describes in the Structures of World History, he says we need to talk about the capital nation state. Not just capital, not just state. They're actually three things of the same phenomenon, right? When state is opposing capital, capital actually benefits. And when capital and state get in war, people go to nation, which could be the cultural zeitgeist that actually runs to save the capital nation state, and the whole triplex actually is maintained, right? And a lot of these, like you're saying, the fight between state and capital, liberals are on the side of maybe state, conservatives on the side of capital, where actually both just functionally operate to keep the entire triplex together, which cannot be reduced down to, say, capital. It's more like, quote unquote, power. It's more like an operation of power that is working with capital in the logic of the state, but it's also this means of framing people that can't just be broken down into GDP numbers or different things. And the movement between the capital, the state, and the nation also has kind of the lifeblood of that, can be the framing of power that is not merely force. But if we don't see power, and then feel free to respond to anything, if we don't see power, then we can just be stuck, either critiquing capital all day long, or critiquing the state all along, or running to a nation. And also the critical thing, like a Michelle Bowens will say, we think the nation is the commons or the social. Well, we don't have the infrastructure anymore for a social. So nation is just ideology that looks like a return to the social, but it becomes actually a nostalgic or utopian project every day of the week. And yeah, it seems like a return to the social. It seems like a grassroots movement, but actually it ends up, unfortunately, without the infrastructure and, dare I say, material condition of bringing back the juvenile middle or the social. It ultimately becomes very ideological. But I throw it back at you.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in a comment I'm about to make because it's about something you said earlier, but I want to get to what you were finishing up on about nation state. But on the point about not being of looking and not being able to see power, I like Zizek's supplement that power today operates on you noticing it. We've made this move from like the medium is no longer transparent where I don't know power is operating, but one of the modes power operates in, and I think power is basically multivalent to where it just switches to whichever one works. So there's not one way it works. But
Yeah.
one of the ways, or sort of a predominant mode of power today, is actually you see it and then you don't do anything about it, or that you
Sure.
cynically engage in it. And this is part
Sure.
of this is part of what I was getting at in my book, is that cynicism, I think, is probably the highest temptation of the modern individual, is that to see that you are being duped and then to sort of like, oh, I'm being duped and go along with it. But somehow the fact that you have this second order reflection or understanding of what's going on means that there's a piece of you that you're able to withhold from the process. And that piece of you sort of treasure as the true, pure part of you that's not stained by your participation in the system, because you understand what's really going on. So you can hold a piece of yourself back. But really, my whole argument in my book is that you've given power exactly what it
Yes.
wants,
Yes.
and that this pure piece you hold back is an illusion and is sort of this booby prize that power lets you enjoy insofar as it affects nothing. Um, so part of the point is that power operates not just invisibly, but actually it can operate on, I see it and I nonetheless go along with it.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I wanted to get into was you talking about the nation state. And this is one thing that I'm trying to work through in my research project. It's a question that still remains open for me, is to what extent is the nation state aligned with capital, and to what extent is it not? Because, and here's where I'm coming from. I'm coming from, on the one hand, seeing that there is, making this argument that the state is this net, and maybe sort of in broader terms, the public sector, whatever is sort of not explicitly market driven. This sector of producing power and symbols and goods and such is it is serving the function of capital, in that it is attempting to produce, it is attempting to take any part of life and understand how it could be a commodity and how it could be an object of intervention. So in that sense, it's serving capital. But Nick Land talks about what he calls the human security apparatus. And to him, the human security apparatus is actually this paranoid response to the inhuman movement of capital. And so there's something to him about which the state is this outmoded Oedipal structure that's trying to clamp down on capital and control it. And so the question is like, is the how is the state supplementary to capital? Is it supplementary in this purely subservient way? Or what truth is there in Land's view that the human security apparatus is almost this, and he doesn't put it this way, it's like this right brain Oedipal structure that's trying to modulate the unhinged feedback loops of the left brain rationality function in capital. I'm curious, what do you think about that?
I think that's a brilliant point. First, I agree with what you were saying on Zizek. I think that's brilliant. And I think it is an oscillation. I think that's very, very true. And, for me, even if like the funny thing about the cynic, which I really appreciate your work, is where you go, oh, I see it, but I'm kind of above it. But like what's so brilliant is that move where you don't see how you're preserving your own inner space and how that actually plays into the very thing that you think you're seeing the whole of, right? The very move of cynicism plays into it. So there's this always this kind of double valency that's going on. I think that's brilliantly put. I think what you're saying, what's very interesting again with Cortani is the idea when he talks about the capital nation state, it's not necessarily that they are all in agreement working together, but that even the conflicts between it ultimately just work to be absorbed back into the structure. That even when the state is working on capital, well, then they just do regulation capture, right? Then the people who work for the banks then join the government in order to actually let those things go. Or then you'll have a gain of the state where they'll actually say, give people, say, healthcare or child tax benefits, but then capital comes along and uses that as evidence that we need more free markets because look, the government is overreaching and they're just buying their votes. And so you have the conflict itself ultimately kind of functions in different ways for the whole of the triplex in different things. Now, I think what Mr. Land is also getting at, though, which I really appreciate, because for me, the capital, this is where I do like, as we all know, Mikey Downs' work on this movement of capital to AI in the state. Ultimately, the capital nation state, I trace back to the movement of, to be very broad, if we look at E.O. Wilson's idea of the conquering of the world with the social, where human intelligence, the reason we didn't become dolphins, because if you were looking back on mankind, you would have said dolphins would take over, but they didn't, is because we could gather around a fireplace and we had thumbs. So we had social intelligence, right? So we were able to communicate together. That's why humans, well, then you get to Mary Douglason's on institutions. The problem, though, is when you have social intelligence, there's the question of which categories are authoritative, right? Why should I listen to, your categories or my categories? So you create institutions that have an authoritative structure so that you can actually socialize, right? Well, now we're moving up the abstraction chain, right? Well, then from institutions, you start moving into things like, well, actually above even them is rationality, capital R rationality, and the Enlightenment are different. And I'm jumping a lot. And then, of course, this greater and greater fungibility and abstraction of human intelligence to become a thing in of itself. And then if we go from rationality to capital, and then capital, in order to become its own entity, moves into, say, the capital nation state, well, then beyond all of that can just be AI, right? Beyond all of that can just be using it is actually intelligence that's just going to kind of break through. I definitely think that, especially when we look at kind of history of the relationship between market and state, I definitely think that the state kind of runs in to try to regulate the market and that the market is actually operating. There's an antagonistic relationship between those things. But I guess what I see too is as that's going on, there's something in the background that the very frame of that very antagonism isn't enabling. That's more of this ever abstraction of the basically human rationality, capital R, through all of these processes that ultimately kind of eclipse them, that is going on. That's my first impression. Let me throw it back at you.
Yeah, I just want to say I think that Land's contention is that that rationality that's emerging is not human rationality.
Right.
That humanity is just kind of like a very early phase of the emergence of that rationality, and that there's the next level of progression, the next level of abstraction, humanity is not going to make it through to the other side of that sort of that development.
Yeah.
I agree. I like your point about. I basically think humans sitting around a campfire are a computer.
Yep.
Like the very first computer just a circuit of circulating signs, and then you're able to sort of bubble up insights from that circulation and transfer. Um, but you're right. At a certain point, if insight is produced by that computational activity, then you want a way to be able to take that insight and be like, okay, now we're going to use this insight. Like we're actually going to implement this insight in a systematic way so that we don't have to rediscover insights every single time, and we can actually act on the things that we learned. So there has to be some way to create objective structure that we relate ourselves to, because we need to be able to implement those insights that were gained as kind of a I would say maybe like a heritage or an inheritance from past computational actions that have taken place. And then, you develop rationality as a way of, hey, rationality is just a better way of adjudicating the process of computation to where we find that better ideas come through when we engage in this process. And the bad idea, like good ideas aren't getting suppressed for bad reasons and blah, blah, blah. And So one thing I'm thinking about, I'm not sure if you've picked up Benjamin Studebaker's new book on legitimacy. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard him talk about the ideas in a number of contexts. And it's just, there's a big emphasis on how people perceive certain deliberative processes as legitimate or not. So I think that deliberation is kind of this early computational work that human beings are doing. But because human beings are left and right brain, there's never just pure um, the pure cybernetic loop of autonomous rationality, as you say, is never sort of going completely off the rails. And Nick is basically saying that it now is going off the rails. We added zero. We unlocked we unlocked Renaissance rationalism and mercantilism. So um, yeah, I'm curious if there's anything in there that you wanted to, any
No,
direction you want.
I think the fascinating point that Nick Land is making is that it is not, so there's an idea that rationality would be impossible without human beings, right? Well, with the computer, basically rationality is possible without human beings. So you can no longer assume that rationality is not the essential thing versus the accidental thing, right? If I were to use that basic Aristotelian language, right? Like up to the existence of, the computer, it was not, you couldn't, it was easy to think that rationality was accidental to the essential element of the human being, right? But if rationality can operate without the human, well, then it's kind of up for grabs what the more primary thing is, right? And for me, Nick Land is, I view Land as a causer of the question of what is going to be the direction, right? Like Andrew Luber and Alex talk about theme and the causer, right? Now that we're experiencing the very real possibility of rationality going on without the human being, the question is the following. Is there anything you can do about that? And if so, what would that look like, right? You're at the causer. You're at this, is it going to be a commedia or is it going to be a tragedy kind of question, right? Oh, and if rationality goes on without human beings, in a way, it's not a tragedy because there's no humans around or they don't have a say for it to be tragic. This could get into is human beings tragic for ants or other animals, right? It's always a scope question on different things, so which makes it interesting. So I think Land, Land, I think is very much correct on this idea that we're seeing this possibility of a rationality that can operate without human beings, and thus for just kind of use us, right? I think that then also speaks to the question of what exactly is it that the human being can do and that defines them that would actually form, say, a dialectic with that rationality or kind of back and forth that could emerge to different speculative reason as opposed to a replacement? Well, if that's even possible, there would have to be the realization of the limits of rationality, right? Which we don't really believe in, right? If the market's rational, therefore it's good, right? So to me, AI, in the way that Land is describing, in order for rationality to not become its own thing, basically requires the acknowledgement of the limits of autonomous rationality. Because otherwise, there's nothing that human beings can do that would, say, dialectically operate with that rationality that AI will do better than us, that would actually add a new speculative possibility. And this is, of course, where we talk about social coordination, the particular, this kind of fuller intelligence that can come out in, say, group conversations like this or Theory Underground, Philosophy Portal, et cetera, so forth. I'll say quickly, too, and then give it back to you on the legitimization crisis. I haven't read Studebaker's new book yet. I have listened to him, and I did read his The Way is Shut, which I enjoyed very much. I think, and then obviously there's Habermas and all these different things. We have this problem where legitimization, for most, the brain struggles to give legitimacy to something that it cannot understand, right? Like that's where deliberation, there's a real way in which the function of democracy is to make us feel like the result is legitimate, right? Almost more than even the outcome of democracy, the idea is that it makes you feel like the outcome is legitimate, right? Well, when that social contract breaks, or people don't necessarily trust the outcome or it doesn't feel legitimate, then you get all these different issues, right? But then, of course, there's the million-dollar problem. And the greater the complexity, the more by definition it can't be fully understood, right? Like the larger the system, the more legitimacy cannot be based on an understanding of the process, right? Well, what do you need then? A no-knowledge proof? What would legitimacy look like with a no-knowledge proof? Where you can just see it and know, oh, it must be legitimate because of the outcome, right? What is that? Is that even possible? And I do think we have to rethink legitimacy. But then, of course, that would probably not be very easy to do if you are stuck with an autonomous rationality, because in an autonomous rationality, the only grounds of legitimacy is a rational process that leads to a rational outcome. Oh, well, AI then by definition will be the only legitimate source of insight, right? Like, I think this problem of legitimacy basically means AI gets the say, right? Which is kind of weird because you can't access the black box to know its process, but there's an assumption of it must be right because AI came out of it. So there's an interesting sort of saturation contradiction that might be the thing to poke on to think these new angles. But those thoughts, I throw it back to you.
Yeah, well, it just made me think of it's almost like a regression to older forms of legitimacy where you cast lots to see who's going to be the king. You like, what's the difference between that and putting a prompt into an AI and then it spits out a result? Um, Now, what's interesting is, models like DeepSeek, we're starting to see where it can actually model its thought process for us. Of course, it could develop a way to deceive us about its own thought process, so there's still limitations there. But um, since we since we don't like ultimately understand even where the AI is getting its insights, um, and you can produce different insights at different times based on different, or even the same prompt in different sessions, so it's very strange. Um, but yeah, it makes me think of just casting lots to see who's going to be king, and maybe there is something. It makes me think about as well about the fact that Zizek makes the point that it's precisely the irrationality or the contingency of the king that makes him legitimate. It's like that he just happens to be this guy who happened to be born to these two people, through some contingent roll of the die at the kind of cosmic fate level. This guy happened to be born. All right, you know, um, that it's actually the irrationality of it which grounds the agreement and the legitimacy around that.
I think that's a brilliant. I mean, it makes me think of this emphasis in some thinkers of, the counter-enlightenment, as some people call it. Some people don't like that name, but the counter-enlightenment, where like Hartman, all these different people are basically saying, and Isaiah Berlin stresses this as well. They're like, hey, if at the basis of your society isn't some sort of axiom or premise that's shrouded in darkness that you can never access, and that becomes the basis of your society, if rationality is allowed to question that, then everything will fall apart. There has to, in a very funny way, the counter-enlightenment and many of those kind of more conservative thinkers were saying at the heart of society has to be a black box. And if you allow rationality to question everything, it will necessarily find that this black box is empty or it can't stand up to rational scrutiny. You'll tear it down, and now you have totalitarianism of the Adorno and Horkheimer sense, right? So it's funny that AI, in a way, just like you're saying, returns us to faith in the black box, faith in this thing that you cannot access or that you can always question. And it's weird too, because like you're saying with Zizek's point, the very grounding of this legitimacy is in a fundamental irrationality, because in being on the face of it irrational, you don't try to rationally understand it. Like it's not trying to be rational. It's like, yeah, it's just kind of irrational. Well, then you don't deconstruct it per se. You don't try to break it through. You just kind of accept it. And what's very interesting is it makes me think of your work, because in the same way, that same move of absorbing legitimacy, I almost want to say, not arriving at legitimacy, this kind of, well, obviously I want to say non-rational legitimacy, because, I always like to say the word non-rational, this non-rational legitimacy that is absorbed versus calculated. In a way, that's what institutions do. In a way, that's what the care does, right? You just kind of absorb, oh, they care about me, therefore it's legitimate. You don't actually calculate it or do the numbers like, Illich and Medical Nemesis or his works on disablement. Once you actually calculate it, which I think it's very important, because there's almost a way too where if you ask, do these things that care about me actually care about me? How dare you ask that? How dare you question the medical field? How dare you question the government? Like, there's a way in which if you question it, you're a bad person. Well, that makes me think of the king. How dare you question the king? How dare you question the traditions? It's interesting to me how there's a similar sort of black boxness, I want to say, or this care creates this effect where you're not allowed to question the care. You just have to absorb it. But then the problem is, there's an exploitation that occurs, right? Which then I'll throw it back to you. It always speaks to me of the tension between, of course, if you have this black box at the heart of society in this counter-enlightenment sense, and then people like Philip Reeve talk about this, if you never question it, then people can use it to exploit you and take advantage of you. But then if you question it, you can destroy the basis of the society, which then means everything has to be arrived at by rational calculation, which then can lead to its own trouble, right? But then if you don't, there's this certain tension of people using that to take advantage of you, right? And I think you actually can see that in a way with the care and the institutions and different things.
Yeah, I want to call the black box that you're describing, I'm tempted to call it the unconscious.
Mm,
But when I do that, it makes me wonder because in I think like in the tradition of Deleuze and Guattari that Nick Land is pulling from, it's actually the unconscious which is the machinic. It's
mm,
actually the unconscious which is the machine that works on the principle of repetition. It's actually the unconscious is almost the thing that is inhuman in us. And so on the one hand, you're like, oh, rationality has this unconscious. There's sort of like a shadow, like rationality has its shadow, like a dark shadow. But we want to identify rationality with the machine. But really, perhaps it's the case that the unconscious is the machine.
mm.
And so now it's like, wait, we've got two frames where we're reading rationality as the machine, but there's also the unconscious. So is it the case that the machine is split? Are human beings one side of the like? Do we? Yeah. So my brain is now just like, like short circuiting a little bit.
No, I think it's a huge question. I think it comes back to the capital nation state because there's a similar, like, is the capital split? Is the nation split? Are they all in it together? Is it this kind of thing held together by a tension that the reason the capital nation state holds together is because of the power, quote unquote, as you're describing it, is the glue that keeps that structure together, even though each point of the structure is actually in conflict with one another. And then that all of that is moving in a kind of Landian trajectory unless we recapture the human or come to even know what the human is, right? So likewise, there's something about the relationship between the human and the AI that I think does draw into question on what is the characteristics of the unconscious and on what is rationality. So it poses a question that creates a tension, that in that tension creates a life of its own that has a trajectory and where it is going. And if we don't want it to go in the Landian direction where we're, pulled to a Feng Numenam or something we can't pass, then there's some sort of owning of the process, some sort of tearing with the process that has to be considered. And those are some first thoughts.
Well, this is why I'm drawn to the idea of the unconscious because it is through objects that we develop ourselves as human beings. Human beings are we're never just limited to this physical body. Like I've got a Substack note that I'm like posted weeks ago that I'm still getting likes from. It says your nervous system runs through cables under the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm still getting likes from this note. It's one of my best performers, I guess. So, but this is basically though just what Marshall McLuhan is saying. Like the construction of a giant network of cables sending electrical signals all around the world is the construction of a new global nervous system. And that nervous system runs right through your brain. You are a node in
Yes.
a physical material network of electrical signals because your body is literally composed of electrical signals. And you are now hooked into a new, larger system of electrical signals. So I want to see, like, from the very beginning, human beings have never just been confined to their own bodies. I mean, we can at least argue that human beings are they are networked bodies, and then so there's both development through other humans, but there's also development through non-human objects. The Heidegger hammer example. The hammer is an extension of me into the environment, and therefore the hammer actually exerts retroactive causality on me to fundamentally make me a different creature, which is a creature that can act on my environment in this way. And now I see myself as a creature that can act in this way. But really, I'm developing and unfolding myself through the inclusion of non-human objects within my own being, within my own person. And so the thing that we have to get a handle on is that human beings have always been cyborgs. From the moment we threw a rock, we were cyborgs. And I think that so we can't just make this problem of technology go away. It's not just a question of do we use it, do we not? And maybe that's banal to say, but part of what I'm trying to explore through this critical bureaucratic studies project is arguing that bureaucracy is a technology.
Mm.
And it's a way of creating an objective structure that allows for the automated um, processing of information and the generation of um, decisions and interventions. So I want to see bureaucracy, like the early emergence of things, like the I want to make a difference between, say, um, Qing bureaucrats in China, and
Mm.
what we have now. But I also want to see them be because one's operating under their disciplinary society that Foucault describes, and we're not under that paradigm of power, although that paradigm of power persists, in some places. Some places you might find yourself in a disciplinary context. So, Foucault's very clear that it's never just like a wholesale switch. Usually, the older paradigm kind of hangs around or pops up its head, or, anyways. I want to distinguish older forms of bureaucracy from new ones, but I also want to see a continuity. So the reality is that temple grain complexes in Sumeria, those are an early form of automation because the goal is to create an objective structure where the individual who occupies a particular symbolic position in that structure is irrelevant. It is irrelevant who the scribe is as a person. All that matters is that he objectively follows the protocol for intaking, processing, and making a decision on information like how much grain is in the silo and who owns it and what's being transferred between individuals. So, like I said, the campfire is a computer, and then bureaucracy is this larger, more objective structure for human computing at a like larger than communal scale. And so I want to see how does bureaucracy as a technology fit into this new paradigm of power as operating through security, through a model of security that Foucault is elaborating. And you brought up Illich a lot. I think he's really relevant to this.
Brilliant comment. I think what you're saying on, the objects develop us, that we are indivisible from our objects. This cannot be overstated. Um, for me, a way I kind of think about it is that technologies are an extension of us in our historic moment, which then when we face it, we have to ask the question, are we equal to that, or is there a surplus? And a way I think about it is like AI is a kind of extension of us, which then poses the question at the causer of, do we equal that? Or is there some surplus to that? Is there some lack to that? Oh, which, by the way, if that technology is in a way an extension of us, whatever that surplus is, doesn't actually exist yet. It's us seeing the thing that is like us that can actually be the feedback loop that leads to the surplus or leads to the extra, the plus one. That the very facing of this equal sign, this potential equal sign, then stimulates. Because like AI is like us, which then begs the question, does it equal us? And if you say no, encountering that kind of question, that in of its very self can be the question that creates the thing that is actually in excess to it that wouldn't have occurred without the encounter of the technology. That's the kind of weird causal impact where you have to make the technology that threatens to replace you, but that very threat of replacement as the equal sign is precisely the mechanism of stimulating the possible cultivation and creation of abilities the human would otherwise not have. So that technology is not the enemy. It's only the enemy if you don't ask the right questions in its presence, per se. If you don't face it in the right way. And I think, the way I kind of look at Illich is not anti-technology. He wants convivial technology, and he kind of contrasts. In the book where he's talking with Carly, he's kind of like, yeah, Duquois-Lu is really pessimistic. I'm not that pessimistic. I actually see technology as possibly extending human beings. Illich, for me, wants you to pay attention to the dynamics that form in the use of the technology that you absorb without realizing it. So as an example, cameras are great, but when you have a camera, you can then start wondering, am I taking enough pictures? What if the people at the party think I'm not? What if they get, like, if I only take one, does that mean I'm not having a good time? You start asking social dynamics because of the presence of the technology that makes you unable not to use it. And that's the key. It's in the middle space between the technology and the social that is actually the problem, and the social expectations, more so than the technology itself. He almost suggests, I think this is true, that we as human beings naturally arrive at saturation points with technology, actually. Like you'll be, if there wasn't social expectation, you'd be doing your texting on your phone and naturally say, I'm done with this. But it's when other people are contacting you or other people might be mad at you because you didn't text them back, that's when you become a prisoner. So you can't, the key is that you can't talk about the bads of technology without talking about the social dynamics that form around the technology. And I think that's very important. The cell phone wouldn't be so bad if your boss couldn't call you at midnight. That's when it's a problem. So there's a social, but then the question is the following. Do you get rid of the technology or do you retrain the social expectations, right? Do you own the social or do you demonize the tech? Well, it looks like, well, you regain the social. But the social's hard because that's psychoanalytic stuff right there. That's when you have to talk with people. That's when you have to figure out what are the expectations we're going to have as human beings and et cetera. So, but you have to be able to talk and understand difference and pluralism and all of that, which goes to your next point when you're talking about bureaucracy, because the way I think about it is basically, it's not by chance that democracy, quote unquote, or Democrat, whatever you want to call it, in America turned into bureaucracy because basically democracy, any democracy that cannot handle negativity becomes bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is where democracy goes, right? Because I'm always fascinated, Tocqueville in Democracy in America. One, it's interesting, if democracy, as Sheldon Wolin talks about as an event, and he's adamant that the democracy Tocqueville is talking about is not the same as what we tend to mean by democracy. If I were to say something very general that I will not defend, it's basically philosophical dialogue in terms of economic, social, and people who are able to engage with ideas and actually implement a commons on the ground of it, right? So it's very, very philosophical conversation. But here's the problem. Naturally, what ends up happening that Tocqueville noted is people start getting embarrassed because, they have their ideas and their ideas aren't as good as the other guy. So you go, well, I make more money than you anyway. Or you say, well, I'll just get into power and do it. What ends up happening is you turn toward institutions to shut down the debate when you lose, right? Because the problem with Tocqueville's democracy is literally it is kind of equal. The poor guy could have a better point than the rich guy, and the rich guy, it's only going to last if he's able to handle that negativity and not retaliate, right? And so he also starts talking about the nakedness that Americans felt when faced with European aristocrats and how they'd want to hide with it. Well, to me, this is all fascinating, and I'll give it back to you, is because Tocqueville is, for me, suggesting the necessity of, if I use the term psychoanalytic very broadly, psychoanalytical thinking in order to actually make democracy work. And the problem that happens, you see, again, it goes, bureaucracy is the technology. I think that's brilliantly put. In the same way writing and books are. Well, if we look at William Ong, the book allows us to, not memorize everything. So we have more, as Samuel Lungcar says, flexible memory, which is tied to creativity. So we outsource to the manuscript in order to open more inner space, if you grant me that language, right? Well, bureaucracy is no different. Technologies are no different. You're opening up your mind. But here's the main problem. The greater your inner space, if you will, for creative possibilities, the more psychoanalytical tensions and anxiety become more powerful to you, right? The more you're stuck in them. So being able to handle negativity and face all those different things becomes all the more important, one, because your mental space is more in those directions because you're not doing manual labor as much, or you're not, you have these technologies. And two, the degree you feel those tensions is actually probably higher because you have this deeper space. I think about Dr. Anton, when he talks about William Ong, he was talking with Guy Senstock, and he made the point that before the written word, the feeling of anger and the speaking out of anger were like this, the ability to separate the feeling of anger and the speaking of anger or acting out of emotion was very tight because the inner space was not as trained by the experience of the written word, right? Like you more just what happened is what you responded to. You could say humans were much more causal than creative, you could say, for good and for bad. This is not necessarily good that we have more inner space. The point is that with the written word, and Justin Murphy put out that piece based on Illich, where Illich says the invention of internal reading. It used to be people, when they read, would speak aloud, and St. Augustine notes that with his master was he was amazed when his master was able to read silently, right? Well, William Ong would be all over that because he would be like, yeah, the ability to basically experience something and then internalize it and choose to respond to it, that is something that's given to you by technologies, the more your flexible mind is done. Well, that also runs the risk of you going inside and, getting repression and all of these different problems. So it opens up this entire horizon of, again, just to speak very broadly, psychoanalytical tensions. And I just finished Duane Roussell's book on psychoanalytical sociology, which I think is very relevant here. And basically, I think kind of in some respects, we scapegoat technology and bureaucracy to a certain degree. We make them necessarily evil because otherwise we might have to face these inner tensions and psychological problems we don't want to face, because that's what would be required to regain the social that could then use the technologies as an extension of the human, but that would require facing certain difficulties we don't want to do. So it's this interesting tension where you want to acknowledge technology can be bad, bureaucracy can be bad, but then if we go and say it is bad, well, that's a regression and probably is often, well, that's going to probably just serve the capital nation state, honestly, or serve power, because when all the unintentional consequences are of getting rid of that, and then people are overwhelmed, oh my gosh, we can't manage all this complexity, and then you just run back to the Grand Inquisitor, and the Grand Inquisitor is stronger than ever, because this all also makes me think of, obviously, that famous section out of Dostoevsky. But let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, I'm really interested about what you're saying. So what I'm hearing is I'm going to restate it in my way. Instead of talking about it as like inner space, maybe what I would say is let's imagine that a human brain has 8 GB of RAM processing power, and if you want to engage in some sort of creative activity, if you've got all of your applications running simultaneously, let's say that takes up 6 gigs of RAM. You only have 2 gigs of RAM to work with at any single time before you're maxing out your RAM. So if you outsource those other applications, or you can quit them because you put them somewhere else, now you've freed up your 8 GB of RAM. And so this is what you're saying has happened. We've freed up the gigabytes of RAM, and we've opened up this new expanse for play in the realm of contingency and ideas and of images and signs. And so we've got all of these tools and a field in which those tools can appear to us. But what this has done is that now it's sort of brought us into an even more naked confrontation with the negativity that's at the heart of cognition itself.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I think about is it seems like we're running into the problem of we're trying to work through negativities that are ingrained in human beings on the order of millennia. Like democracy, for instance, is an attempt to construct a psychosocial technology that allows us to get beyond tribalism, which is not just some sort of like, oh, it's like if you just learn a new idea, you cannot be tribal anymore. It's like, no, literally it operates at a level that you cannot control it. You subconsciously have different reactions to people who physically look different from you, even if you're not aware it's happening. So like you are so deeply wired to act that way. And to me, I think we are in this space where we're trying to rewire ourselves from like the hardware that took a long time to develop. And this is where some of the leftist project freaks me out, because the leftist project is, no, we're going to have the kingdom of God right now, even though human beings aren't wired to handle it. And so we're just going to implement it through objective structure, through the state, through the maybe we could say the communal superego, we're just going to jump straight to the kingdom of God of perfect justice and truth and love. And human beings are not wired for that. And so it causes this eruption of negativity and horror and violence. So, and this is not me saying like this is not worth trying, but I think that like when I see the problem in those terms, it leaves me feeling this kind of deep sense of pessimism. Like, oh my gosh, the task before us is immense.
Brilliant. And I love how you described that with the rent. That was absolutely fantastic. And before I forget, Alex Ebert also has some fascinating thoughts on the black box. He had like a Stoa piece. I really like that. What you just said, so for me, there is the denial of wires, blank slate. There is no, but there's like, it's a blank slate, basically, which I think some more perhaps progressive thinking can have. But then you have a conservative, we'll just return to the wires. Just go back to the wiring, which is problematic. No, no, no. Our challenge is rewiring. Oh, screw that. That's a mess. Yes. And it actually speaks to,
Oh, sorry, it's the problem of plasticity.
exactly.
Plasticity is neither of these things. There are wires, but it's a system that can reform and reshape itself. So it's a system that can work on itself. So it's neither conservative in that the wires are just what they are, but plasticity also implies that there is a limit. You have like you can't just take a piece of marble and just one scrape and it immediately has its shape. You can't just take the clay and just go and now it's in the perfect shape. You have to shape it over time and the wires have to slowly move. So it has both of these elements.
The problem of plasticity is a beautiful way to put it. I think we look at plasticity as good, as wonderful, but actually it's a problem, no different than freedom. Zizek's work, right? The disease you can't cure, right? Like freedom is a problem, likewise plasticity. And actually I really like that because now it makes me think of the difference between absorbent and plasticity. And again, I keep going back to the capital nation state because I do like Koratani's work on that. The problem is the capital nation state is absorbent. And like it will absorb whatever you throw at it, right? And basically the problem is if we do not own the problem of plasticity, some absorbent structure or power will get us, right? Because when I think about power as you described it, it's absorbent. Like whatever you throw at it, it can absorb and then make you internalize it and you're still working. It's got a kind of absorbent structure. You could call it flexibility, but I don't know if it's flexible. It's more absorbent. That might just be a language thing. Like power has a way of absorbing what you do and you still internalize its mechanism. Like I think about your book, like, what ended up the power that he faced in Japan was able to, his Christian theology, it was able to like move around his theology to make it okay to silently accept the oppressed. It was absorbent. It was able to take his Christianity and absorb it into the mechanism of power that's going on, right? So I'm now thinking lightly, this is just live, the difference between absorbent and plasticity, and where if we don't own the problem of plasticity, then we're basically sitting ducks for some absorbent structure that will absorb us, right? And then, or it will absorb us and leave us behind too, right? Because if we then link together Nick Land and the capital nation state, as we might be rebelling, quote unquote, since it's not a rebellion based on plasticity, it ends up getting absorbed by the capital nation state, and AI and rationality just goes on behind it without us, or through it, or whatever language we want to use. So there's something about plasticity, because the thing too with that, the rewiring is necessarily a slow, gradual, tearing work that's in the realm of habits, aesthetic experience, sociology. Dave has been talking about Pierre Bourdieu on the idea, and I think about James K. Smith on you are what you love, you go to the mall, it works on your subconscious mind. Because what you're saying is rewiring, that's the realm of the subconscious. That's the realm of working on yourself slowly. That's also critically before calculation. It is rewiring is before calculation. So you can't calculate yourself to rewiring. You can't think yourself to rewiring. You have to somehow work on yourself before the rewiring. Well, that's architecture. That's environment. That's Christopher Alexander. That's relation. That's experience, and doing it regularly. Because I love what you said about the rewiring, because as we've talked about before, I view a lot of the social coordination mechanism, what we're doing. Like one of the reasons I stay involved in these theory underground philosophy with this space of, some people call it the liminal web, some people have problems with that language. I've also thought about calling it the Bill Dung 20. if it's based on the kind of Nordic idea and it's 20, because I think after COVID-19 it was accelerated, so Bildung 20. So I don't know. This kind of movement, I think you actually have to perpetually be interacting in this kind of way of thinking precisely to rewire your training. And if you don't do it regularly, like going to the gym or something, then you actually will just fall back into the previous patterns. And actually, too, and then I'll give it back to you, I think rewiring is brilliant, because I do think, as you know, we talk about menti-divergence or neurodivergence and how the only way to overcome game theory problems is not more rationality, but a non-rationality that is more like neurodiversity, not equivalent to it, but more like a different way of thinking versus better thinking the way that is assumed and associated with the neurotypical. Like in Belonging Again, we talk about Lorenzo's work, we talk about Simone Weil, like this idea that you actually have to have a mentally divergent thinking, different ways to language it, that is a product of a rewiring, which is very different than simply saying we need to become more rational. Because the moment you talk about rewiring, you're talking about mediums. You're talking about new structures of operation. You're talking about new environments. And actually, what's interesting about that, and Yuri said this based on Michael Levin's idea at the net the other day, and then I'll give it to you. You know, Michael Levin, to very much simplify his thinking, is that idea you can take single cells or simple biological entities, and if you put them in different environments, different latent potential comes out, right? That seems to actually be in the thing. And he does his work on xenobots and so on and so forth. But literally the latent potential that comes out, almost teleological, although that's a loaded word, changes based on the environment you put things in, right? Well, that does seem to be how human beings are. Like, based on the environment you put them in, not the ideas you give them, but the medium or environment you put them in, they develop differently. Well, Yuri was basically saying, you know, if the word genius means anything, which is a dangerous word, but if you grant it here, if that word means anything, perhaps genius is the ability to recognize the environments that will draw out a certain or different latent potential. Like, you don't merely think about what are my abilities, which could be individualistic and thus feed the scene. You say, what environment do I need to go into to bring out the latent potential I have, or the latent potential that could be alternative to the logic that is leading me somewhere I need to go? Like, to link intelligence with environment, not idea. Discerning different environments seems to be very important here, but let me throw it back at you.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to say there, but I think that the first thing that comes to mind just with that final point is I I think that it's not when I'm thinking, it's not me who is thinking. It's the
Mm,
field that is thinking. The field in which I am is thinking, and my thinking is included in that thinking. But like thinking, for instance, at the brain level is an electrical transmission between two nodes. You have to have two nodes for thought to happen. And the thinking is not happening in any, you can't isolate the thinking to the node, to any particular node. The thinking is what takes place in the field created by the relation of the nodes. And so I think that, and we're thinking together right now, and like the environment, the field is thinking itself through us
yes.
right now. And this thinking that we're having is not possible if I was just sitting thinking on my own. And so I want to make that point. The field is thinking, is not that you are thinking.
Yeah.
But the thing that I wanted to go back to, way back on absorbent structures.
Yeah.
I think absorbent structures, one thing that came to mind as you were describing them are structures that do not have sufficient grounding with the outside for resistance.
Mm,
Like a system that is absorbent doesn't have enough resistance from an outside that checks its movement.
nice.
So like that's why any symbol that kind of comes into its range or its field of into its field, it can just pull it in seamlessly into the system. It could just pull it into the signifier whirlpool, this just the churning of signs, because this churning of signs is all in the service of basically the will of the sovereign. in this particular case. It's just it could be twisted whichever way you want because it doesn't have some sort of interaction with a negativity that's creating a friction. So, if you get that system into interaction with some sort of an outside or a negativity, you start to get a force that checks the system and forces it to start to update itself. And it can't just operate seamlessly where it just kind of takes up any sign and churns it into a slurry that is that you could theoretically sort of turn any which way. Like in a conversation, the ideologist, the propagandist can sort of take up alternate positions. They can just constantly keep shifting their position and never be wrong because there's no grounding in any sort of a negativity that would check them or force them to take up a position that could actually be argued.
I think that's a brilliant way to put it. So the absorbent, in a way, lacks otherness. It lacks adequate otherness, per se, like that which is other from it. Whereas plasticity entails adequate otherness, because the whole reason it's plastic is because there's an otherness to be plastic regarding, right? Like that can make it plastic, right? So that's very interesting because that makes me, again, there's a way in which Karatani suggests is that although capital, nation, and state could check and balance one another, his argument is that they've gotten to the place now where they lack adequate otherness, we might say. And we also, though, lack the capacity in our individual subjectivity to provide that otherness to the capital nation state to restore it to a plasticity between itself, which, of course, is what power has done. Power has made us incapable of being the adequate otherness to the capital nation state to actually bring it back into a, well, more checks and balance structure, basically, where they're not even if they're antagonists, they're still absorbent in that antagonism of the whole, right? Which then is ultimately from Nick Land just leading to rationality living without us, right? So that adequate otherness, but that's a brilliant way to put it, I think, because again, when I read Tocqueville and others, we couldn't handle the other. So, we gave up on we couldn't handle the other. We couldn't handle dealing with the other. So we let the technology do it. And then we get mad at the technology for taking away our humanity. And technology is like, well, you didn't want to be human because being human is being plastic. There's something about being human and being plastic in the sense that are two sides of the same coin. Because I think the field thinks 100%. The field thinks that's exactly right. There's something about being human that is the participation in a thinking field. But that, by definition, requires being able to handle adequate otherness. And if you can't, then you don't want to be human. And technology is like, no problem. We'll help you not be human. And then we get mad at technology for making us not human. And technology is like, well, then I guess you're going to have to deal with adequate otherness. And we don't want to. And so we just get in this kind of meaningless saying technology is evil as we continue to be extended by it, et cetera, so forth, right? And I think the same goes with bureaucracy. I think all of that goes together. And I think, too, like, again, it's just so important to realize, like, let's just talk about demonizing capital. Like we say, well, capitalism is evil. We don't like capitalism, et cetera, so forth, right? Well, what mode of exchange are you going to go to other than the commodity form? Okay, trading with your neighbor, getting to know your neighbor and different things, or exchanging with one another. Well, you can't stand your neighbor, or you don't know how to talk with them, or you don't even like being around them, right? So, okay, so what is the mode of exchange by which you're going to operate? Unless you just know every single skill you need to survive or every single good or different things. I mean, there's really a way, too, in which what Tocqueville identified is as people talked about hating, not necessarily liking their occupation, they simultaneously would use it to create status or to talk about or have something to talk about or to give their life intelligibility to the other person. We don't like our merchant occupation, but then we also want to be able to, make ourselves intelligible to the other person. If everyone has a job under capital, there's an intelligibility we have for one another versus somehow figure out how to be intelligible without labels per se, which are almost like fig leaves. Well, that's like philosophical dialogue then. That's something with the humanities. That's actually learning how to interact or maybe to do some serious play or something. Well, we don't want to do that because in serious play we may lose. And what if we, talk about ideas that are wrong? And what if we destroy the expectations of the society? There's all sorts of risk, right? I mean, risk is a big thing. Like if you want to actually, well, this is what's interesting. I don't think you can have adequate otherness and thus plasticity without risk taking, without facing a fear, right? Well, if we don't want to take risk, all as we talk about risk taking, because the capital market provides a sense of risk taking, but there's no human risk taking. So we convince ourselves we're not afraid of risk, but actually we are, because the risk taking is isolated to the capital structure, which then functions as kind of self-deception that we are not afraid of risk, but actually with human beings we very much are, or doing something that is outside of the intelligibility of the market per se. So there's a kind of self-propaganda that is occurring there. But if you're not able to take risk, well, then you can't. You cannot maintain the human. And the field, and when the field thinks, there's always a risk in that, right? Because if the field is thinking, it thinks beyond you. Well, what if well, who knows where that may go? What if it goes somewhere I don't want to go? What if I'll have to change my life? Because once an idea arises, I can no longer go back to the day before I thought it. And that's always and then I'll give it back to you. Like, one of the risks of like the field and why I think we avoid it is because it's not prompted. AI is going to tell us what we prompted. So we don't really have to run the risk so much of being told something we don't want to hear or that we're not prepared for and thus may have to change our life. Whenever you're dealing with fields, you're dealing with a lot more, and I don't mean to say AI has none of it, but with fields, there's a lot more unpredictability. There's a lot more who knows what could come, right? And what if something is said that then you have to change your life, like that Wilka poem? Oh, but I don't want to risk that because I'm comfortable. Or what if it like makes me give up my beliefs or have to do something different, right? Well, the only way to keep the human is for the field to think. So if you're not willing to enter into that space where the surprising can occur, well, then the field won't be there to think, and you're done just thinking like a node per se, which ultimately is just autonomous rationality. And if that's all the human does, then even if the humans are still walking around, they basically have been replaced by AI, even if humans are still around. There's just different computer models. Some is in a biological body that does it. Others is on a tower somewhere. But if all we do is think in terms of nodes, like you were describing, then basically rationality has replaced the human being, even if humans are still walking around, because there's no definite difference, and it's all been absorbed. It's all been absorbed into rationality versus made plastic with adequate otherness to rationality. But let me throw it to you.
The point about risk is really apt because it comes back to Foucault's model that we're living in a society of security. And what is security but the reduction of risk?
Yeah.
And so, like in his lectures, which I'm reading through, security, territory, population, he early on in the lectures he's describing the emergence of the idea of security and how you lay out a city. So the physiocrats in France are talking about how you lay out a city in an exact way in order to facilitate the circulations that are already natural to the body politic. And so Foucault describes security as one of the ways to describe security is the maximization of flows, of circuits within a particular enclosed territory, within a field. But then what he is also describing in security, in the concept of security, is that each of these flows is being used to modulate the other flows. So instead of imposing a rule from the outside, what you do is you understand the flows that are inherent to an organism, and then you allow those inherent flows to check and work on each other to keep each other in balance. And what he then says is that the goal of security is to bring each of these flows and circuits into alignment with a statistical norm. So the goal is to sort of eliminate these tail risk events, both, upper and lower bounds, if we're thinking of the horseshoe statistical distribution of outcomes. So there's these flows that are producing events, and events have a distribution on a chart. And the goal is to bring more and more of these events into the normalized center of the horseshoe, or you want to use other things to kind of maybe move the horseshoe, directionally. There's a lot of things that you could do, but the point is that it's about reducing and controlling risk, bringing things into a known statistical distribution. And so I think that part of the horror of kind of modern politics is this overriding drive to control, reduce, and eventually eliminate risk. It it produces all kinds of evil, but it does so under this guise who can oppose safety. Who's going to be the asshole who comes out and says, "No, I want, more children to get hit by cars." Like who's going to be the person who like opposes safety? And so you have to impose control under the guise of the good, under the guise of these things that are caring. But ultimately, it's in pursuit of these impossibilities. And ultimately, I think that the great evil of the human project is to eliminate death itself and to achieve immortality. That's the ultimate core. If your political philosophy is driven and in service of the project of immortality through the elimination of death, then you are worshiping at the altar of Molech and you will be consumed.
Well, that's magnificently put. And, as a quick note, these massive it's very interesting because at this point in the game, per se, these very slight nuances make all the difference. The difference between life, eliminating death to live, or going through death to live, right? There are massive differences between these things. But the hope is found precisely that that death is in both of them, and the relation to the death can be changed. Likewise, the problem is not eliminating technology, it's going through technology. It's not about eliminating bureaucracy or AI, it's about going through these things. And the very fact that they're here, that the condition is here, doesn't mean we so much need to add an entire, add something, like add a new nation state, add a new, no, it's the material is present that is needed for the change. What needs to shift is the relation to what we're using the thing for. Are we using bureaucracy to eliminate human interaction, or are we using bureaucracy to open up creative space and flexibility for human interaction in the way we were describing earlier, right? Are we using the written word to gain that inner ability so that we can actually do more incredible things with the field? Or are we reading so that we don't have to talk to the guy on the subway because we're busy, right? Like the same technology that opens the door can also, in being a door, be one we keep closed or shut, right? And so all doors bring with them that choice, right? You can open them or you can shut them or lock them or whatever. So I think that's very well put. What you're also saying on the flows and different things, to me, I think that's, is not the violence of care, the elimination of risk, right? Like the care today is precisely the removal of risk, right? And who could oppose care that wants to remove risk, right? And so what ends up happening, well, this is also why Jesus is always saying, be not afraid. I think basically the question is fear or courage. Like almost everything stems out of that. Like on a fundamental level, is the human going to have courage or not? Well, then everything follows from that. Please.
Let me modify. For me, I agree with you, but I think it's fear or love.
Sure.
That's what I would say.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Because basically, if you can't love, then you may be brave to fight a lion, but if you can't live with someone, commit your life to them, then it's actually not courage. It's a self-deception courage, right? The real courage always comes out in the face of the other, because the other is who can hurt you deepest. Like a lion cannot hurt you as badly as someone you care about saying they hate you, right? There's a weird way in which all the lion can do is rip off your arm, where your lover can destroy your spirit, right? And so real courage has to be with that Boothby dusting almost. It has to be faced with that. And well, before I forget, the plasticity you were talking about, I would also associate with the Beatrice that I always talk about with Dante and unveiling, the slow, gradual unveiling where Beatrice says to Dante, I think Canto 19 or something, where Dante says, Beatrice, why won't you smile? And she's like, well, if I smile at this point, it will reduce you to ash because you're not able to handle the full glory, right? You have to ascend more before you can do it. That's real courage, to be in a situation where if you go just a little too quick, you're reduced to ash or something like that. Also brings to mind, I spoke with Ross Bird, and he talks about the Bible as this story of this tension between inclusion and holiness, where if you encounter holiness too soon, you're killed. Holiness kills you. That's the problem with holiness. Holiness is not all good. It kills you. And so there's a weird way in which God's problem is God. Like God is like, I want a relationship with you, but I'll kill you. What do? Oh crap. I have to somehow veil myself enough to where I can approach you, but not so much that I don't. So you have this perpetual tension between inclusion and holiness, or what I'll just call unveiling with the UN in parentheses, right? To me, when you talk about plasticity, basically that is in the art and figuring out of the unveiling, so we can handle the technology, so the feedback loop is not so much on the side of the tech that we become thoughtless, but not so little that we're actually afraid of it, right? So there's this Jockin with Aristotle will talk about the mean, which is not the middle. This is very important. In Aristotle, finding the mean, which is basically always the intellectual act. This is very interesting. Like basically, intelligence is the ability to judge the mean. It's not merely knowing the solution, but the mean, which is the fittingness, the right amount, the proportion. We do not associate intelligence with proportion. We associate intelligence with right or wrong, and this has gotten us into trouble. For Aristotle, it's the proportion. And sometimes it's 50-50, but most of the time it's 70-30 or 82-18. It's not a clean number. If it was a clean number, then we could outsource thinking, because, you know, we would know the ratio, but it changes situation to situation. So you always have to judge the frickin' mean. But that right there entails risk, because you could be wrong. You could always be wrong, right? And care, in the violent form, is basically saying you don't need to judge the mean. We'll do it for you. We'll just remove risk. There is no judging of mean. Mean, let's put it this way. The bad mechanical, I almost want to just say the bad mechanical is the opposite of mean. Like mechanical and mean are kind of opposites, right? Like if you're not able to do the mean, then everything becomes mechanical. But if you're able to do the mean, then you can keep the mechanical and not be threatened by it, because you're able to proportion it to where it doesn't override you, right? The problem is that we have mechanics, technologies, bureaucracy, etc., without the capacity to judge the mean. And as a result, we are basically just going to ultimately let the mechanic do it all for us, because we can't figure it out, right? Or we become Amish. You have to take some sort of totalizing strategy. If you can't judge the mean, it's either all technology or basically not technology or something. And that's kind of where your kind of angel of history ends up, or something like that. And so there's some sort of judging of the mean that becomes very, very important in this, of the unveiling, that must be with death. Always. I'll give it back to you. Like, here's the thing. Like, in that Dante example, Dante is not eliminating death. He is perpetually at risk of being reduced to ash and destroyed, right? Like, if you're in a relationship of love, you are always at risk of being destroyed. Because even if the person doesn't reject you, if something happens to them, it can destroy you, right? It can destroy you in ways that no injury could. If a true loved one that you're deeply connected is lost or hurt, that can hurt you in incredible ways. This is no escaping of death. This is living with death. This is like, because for me too, like, there's a way, and I'd be curious what you think about that. And I have things to say about Virilio, because I'm thinking about the city you were saying, Foucault, and he's like, you know, Virilio is interesting too. I don't know if you can actually be living with death without relationship. And the reason why I say that is because there's a funny way in which you don't experience your own death. You do. There is a fear of death that you do have to face as an individual, but I'm not sure if that is as much of a challenge as dealing with the death of other people, right? Like, often I encounter a lot of people, they're not, that will easily say they're not so much afraid of themselves dying as they are their loved ones dying, or having their reputation die, like some sort of status. It's interesting how death, I think, to your point, I'd be curious, any thoughts on this? I really do think love and relationship are necessary for death, to actually face death. Because if it's just you as a lone, isolated individual, there's some sort of numbing to the intensity of death that occurs there. I don't want to say there's no work that has to be overcome, but there's some sort of numbing. I'd be curious, any thoughts?
I would just offer in Lorenzo Chiesa's book, The Not One, in the early part, he does this exposition of Lacan, where he talks about how sex is a confrontation with death, and how it's actually sex that introduces us to death, because the act of reproduction is an encounter with the fact that the propagation of the species does not include me living. The reason I have to reproduce is because I will die. Therefore, the act of reproduction brings you into confrontation with the need to reproduce because the species will outlive me. And but we can only engage in that reproductive act because we because of our biological structure, we need to unite the sperm and the egg. Whereas basically Lacan, he's sort of making this argument that if we were worms, we could never develop being towards death, essentially,
Mm.
because worms can reproduce without other people, like without others. So since they can just chop off a part and they can separate, they're not what is it, sexually dimorphic? I can't remember the technical term. Because they're not sexually dimorphic, they never have to encounter their own death as in relation to themselves as a species, as sort of a whole population of creatures. So I would offer that.
I strongly agree. I think that's a brilliant connection. And like you can't be a being toward death without relation. I think that's correct. And what's interesting there is that would mean you can't encounter death. Care is a threat to the being of death that seems to be required for full humanness in the way that we are describing. So the violence of care, in a way, actually deny. Well, it does because it like talks about it. Like the violence of care is also part of a few things. One, it it removes the people who care, like the bureaucracy of the hospital takes care of you, right? So you don't really create relations so much, right? But when it's your society or your social or your family that is taking care of or helping you without, that right there is like the reproduction, because you're constantly in the relations of people that are with you. And there is this sort of sense of, wow, these people will live without me and I actually need them and I can't do everything. There's this constant sort of sense of you're not the whole, this kind of reminder that you're not the whole, if the society is more so taking care of everything. But if you're relying on experts, you're not, yeah, there is this sort of, there is a relation with the expert, but it's not really a relationship. I always think there's a difference between relation and relationship, where relation doesn't really have you encounter the depth of death in the relationship. It is relationship that really brings you to the being toward death. And the more we outsource to care in the bureaucratic institutional way, that actually leads to us not actually having relationships that we need to go through death. And of course, the expert class is often predicated upon the we're actually trying to figure out how to get rid of death too, right? Like the whole promise of a lot of these apparatuses is not only can we take care of you without relationship, we're actually working to get rid of death. So that right there also creates a certain numbing to the experience of death, both in that you are not having as many relationships, you're just having relations with experts. You're also, I mean, the other critical text of Illich is the one I always talk about with the rights to useful unemployment. You're literally made to feel stupid if you say try to build your own house. If you were to try to get the community together and build your own house, you would be seen as a deviant, right? So even trying to draw the community together to make relationships, to do projects outside the expert class is seen as irrational, and regulation will stop you from doing it anyway, right? So you're led toward relations that individualize your death experience more so, and they bring with them a certain promise of escaping death. So it really does move us away from the ability to really encounter the death we need to encounter to be fully human. Because, and the reason I say that is because if courage is tied to all this, love and all of that, then you have to face death to develop the courage that you need to be human and not simply used as an avatar for a rationality that's using you to do what it will for something beyond you, right? Like if you don't want to just be a certain avatar toward the zeitgeist, then you're going to have to require courage, which, as you said so well, can only be done in relationships and love. And the entire system is moving you from relationship to relation that then basically is a kind of unhuman version of relationship, which then makes you an avatar toward the rationality that is leading to the AI and et cetera, so forth.
If you will indulge my corniness for only a moment, um, the difference between a relation and a relationship is that a relationship takes you on a journey.
Yeah.
Because it's a ship. So, anyways, that was a little too much. But I like your difference. So, but Illich is making this point that we've moved from the relationship to the relation,
Hmm.
and because a relationship is mutually productive. There's two agents who are together becoming more than they are individually. Whereas um, the modern, like the bureaucratic institution, the school, the hospital, the prison, these these bureaucracies have created a new relation where you are the passive recipient of goods and services. So what I say is that bureaucracy takes an activity and turns it into a product.
Mm.
So whereas now I used to be healthy because my body is continually producing better and better function, because health is not a state of being. Health is the vital function of an organism
Mm.
doing its thing.
Mm.
That's health. It's an activity. Health now becomes a product which can be delivered to you, like in a video game where you drink a potion and your health bar goes up. Like he- the same with education. The difference between education and learning.
Yeah.
Learning is the self-transformation of an organism through interaction with negativity, like we talked about, through an encounter with adequate otherness. We, as a plastic system, can transform ourselves in relation to new events. That's what learning is. Nobody can produce learning in you.
Right.
You can only facilitate encounters where the learner learns. But whereas education is the creation of a protocol where knowledge can be directly transmitted to you. So, I mean, for now, curriculum just exists because we can't beam information directly into people's heads quite yet. But once we can, curriculum will be useless, because that's the ultimate goal is how do we create the most standard effective process for transmitting X body of knowledge into so-and-so person's head. That is what education is. Um, but it is when it's stated that way, it's like, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not possible, and that's not actually what we want to do. But it's all you can do if you are operating through a bureaucratic process, because bureaucratic processes can only work with information. They can only work with standardized. They only work in the commodity form. So what bureaucracy is constantly doing is taking idiosyncratic, sui generis events, which are the activity of an entity, an organism, a field, and creating, doing this subtle substitution where now there's a product that can be delivered instead of an activity which produces this state of affairs. So to me, this is one of the big insights that I derive from Illich and try to that I kind of chain on to Foucault. We've got this framework of security, um, and bureaucracies that run society. This is how power operates. Well, how does it operate? What it does is it takes non-marketable use values and it turns them into products and services that can be delivered to people, because the goal ultimately, as I posted in a recent piece, is I think that the security state has as its primary mandate from capital to cultivate a to cultivate a population of labor. Like the state is ultimately about stewarding the human capital that capital needs to run on until it can automate us out of existence. So it needs us for now. So this is our window. Capital still needs us. So we have some leverage. If we stop having babies now, capital dies. But give it, I don't know how much more time, but the window's closing to where capital isn't going to need us anymore.
No, I agree. It's the moment of the Calzer. It's the moment of absolute choice, as I'd like to put it. And then, of course, the question is, well, what do we even absolutely choose? And that's what so much of the thinking in these spaces is about. What is actually the conditions of possibility, et cetera, and so forth, right? You said a lot there that was magnificent. I definitely associate quantification with security, because the whole idea of security is, look, Look what we did. We can quantify the numbers. We're always going to meet the quota. There's nothing to worry about. Like numbers and security go together because security gains its authority on meeting the numbers or knowing the numbers or kind of being able to make the future predictable. But of course, the problem is, like, that's another factor of security. Security wants to own the future. It wants to make it predictable, because if we know the future, then we have nothing to worry about. Well, the only way you do that is by removing dynamic variables and creating making everything the same. And that's what schooling does. That's what institution does versus learning. You can predict the future if you remove everything alive. And so if you overemphasize security, yeah, we predict the future. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it will be the moment you can predict the future, it becomes the future you don't want to go to. So that's kind of the issue, right? And so quantification does it. I think what you were also saying, please, on the difference between learning and schooling, which is a tremendous distinction. I know you bring out in the Theory Underground second, where you talk with Dave about as well. I think this is extremely important. It should also be noted when Lena Anderson in The Nordic Secret is talking about the Nordic Bildung. They ask, so what's the secret? Well, the secret is that there's no curriculum. There's no curriculum. It's basically what Illich is saying in deschool. It's basically deschooling. It's just that you go to like the government would subsidize 6 months of basically going to a retreat where there's no curriculum. There's simply finding the environment that will facilitate the coming out. That is critical. And what also I cannot overstress is but the Nordic Bildung though had trouble because you couldn't quantify what the students were going to get before they went. So like nobody wanted to fund them or do anything. The luck was that a few people went, they said, well, come and see like Jesus. And they went and they saw, wow, these kids are able to have a conversation. Maybe we should fund this, right? And then again, her argument is between 1850 and 1950, this educational reform led to incredible riches. So here's the joke. If you put quality before quantity, you get both. But if you put quantity before quality, you get neither. The old first principle of C.S. Lewis that I use all the time. So you put first things first, you get second things too. You put second things first, you get neither. Turns out quality is the first thing and quantity is the second thing. And you can get both. But the problem is quantity doesn't like playing second fiddle. It seems to say, and it always says, well, look at I've got the numbers to show you I should go first. I've got the numbers to show you. What has quality got? Quality ain't got anything. I've got numbers, baby. And so it's always able to make an argument that it should go first. We tend to fall for that temptation in the garden. We tend to bite from that apple, per se, and then you lose either. But again, I think there are case studies after case studies after case studies in history that show societies that put quality before quantity, that put no curriculum, and they created spaces of emergent possibilities. That worked. But those books aren't taught in the curriculum because they would suggest the correct, please.
The problem that you get, and this goes back to what we were talking about, is that when you put quality first, you then have to have a conversation about values.
Exactly.
What constitutes excellence?
Yep.
If you are talking about quality, you're talking about a value judgment. Yep. And then you are back in the realm of adjudicating values. That's a moral realm. And so then now we're back to the problem of how do you adjudicate amongst value systems that are contradictory, vying for importance. And so if you put quantity first, you can maintain the ruse that we can avoid the value conversation. Of course, you sneak the values in unwittingly in most cases, because the reason capital doesn't want to fund schools that don't have metrics is because schools are supposed to produce workers for them, and they have a vision of what they want a good worker to be like. So they only fund the stuff that is in line with their value. They have a vision of the once and future worker who they want to be turned out of the school factory. And so they sneak it in because quantity is sort of seemingly without value, is sort of seemingly pragmatic.
Oh, that's 100% correct. So we want to avoid the value conversation, but this is also where we can say all day, oh, the Enlightenment was bad. The scientific revolution was bad. Well, what was that in response to? a lot of violence, a lot of religious conflict. This is where also we say quantity is bad. No, 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 no. We tried that. So, autonomous, my whole argument, autonomous anything is bad. Autonomous quality is bad, actually, because you can get to values, but not necessarily having the rationality to organize or discuss those values, and thus you get trouble. But the problem is we're in the age of autonomous quantification, right? Like, that's where you then get trouble. But we have to get back to the value discussion, and the value discussion got a whole lot of people killed, and we're really, really, really bad at discussing values. We are insanely bad. Like, the average person is really bad at discussing values, and that's not even a hit on them. It's because it's hard, and they're probably like doing the work that makes the society function, right? So the value conversation is incredibly difficult, like values, metaphysics, philosophy, good, like, but again, it's Tocqueville, because democracy is the value discussion. If you do not have the value discussion, you do not have democracy. And the reason why democracy has been like an event, I love how Sheldon Rowland puts it. He's like, democracy has never been a stable state. At most, there have been moments of democracy, various civil rights movements, various new formations of governments and different things, but you've never had a sustainable democracy, because the value conversation at best lasts for a little bit, usually in a crisis. When a crisis will force people to figure out the value conversation. But if there's no crisis, they don't tend to force themselves to make it work through humility or et cetera, so forth, right? So democracy has never been able to last. The value conversation has never been able to last. Here's the problem. Given everything Land has told us, if we don't figure out how to make the value conversation last, then we cannot offer a surplus to the rationality that would have a dialectical relationship to the rationality or AI that would create a feedback loop that would actually have the human being offering some sort of surplus that is an addition to the AI, and thus we can't extend the human, only be replaced, right? So the value conversation, the ability to have it and to handle it, is at the very heart of the ability of the question of will mankind be extended or left behind, per se, right? And that's an open question. I'm not even saying the answer is there. I'm not moralizing the answer. I'm saying that is the frame of the historic moment before the culture of AI, per se. That is what we're looking at. Well, I think one, because this is really important. We have to think about, like, we've already spoken about things like courage, right? And relationship. There is something about where we have to have the value conversation, value the field itself, not merely principles. Like, most value conversations in history have been principles: equality, justice, freedom. I can go on, right? Well, as we know, that basically no value, here's the weird thing, no principle of value is even itself without all the others, right? Freedom without equality sucks, but equality without freedom sucks, and then justice without freedom sucks, and then all of those suck without beauty. But what is beauty, and how do we do? See, there's this problem now, right? Where every single principle of value requires the other principles to even be itself, A, B, passing over into otherness, all that different jazz, right? Okay, well, that means we need a field. That means we need to actually, like, figure out relationship versus relation. And this is where I become so big on the social coordination mechanism that the internet provides, like we're doing right now, that combines YouTube, Zoom, and all of these decentralized groups. Because basically what you're seeing online is people that are forming fields and valuing those fields. And yes, they discuss the principles of values, but they do so within a field creation. And I guess I also, before I forget, and then I'll throw it at you, is that I want to say, if we make the distinction between relationships and relation, which I think is very good. And I like what you said on the ship, because exactly. Relationships we can associate with fields and plasticity. Relations I want to associate with dynamics and absorbance. Dynamics in the Ivan Illich sense we said with the cell phone earlier, right? So what ends up happening is, if we're not able to handle relationships, we're still going to have relations. We're not going to be isolated. Like, this idea of isolation doesn't ultimately exist. You're always in a horizon of social order. So if you don't have relationships, you get relations. So you end up having dynamics and absorbent structures, right? But where there is relations, there are the possibility of relationships if you can come to handle the negativity. And this is kind of like, how the devil uses, where there's death, that could be used by Jesus on the cross to overmind it. Like the thing that is the threat also entails the mechanism of its possible contradiction and undermining. The very relations that we find ourselves in that are training us out of humanness are the very same material that, if approached in a different way, can be relationships that then bring with them fields and the plasticity that seem to be necessary for us to have an extension of the human versus our replacement. And then I would also say relationships are learning, where relations are school, to use your distinction, right? Like learning happens in relationships, and the relationships themselves are the logic of the learning. We do correct, well, is not a classroom relations. You can't talk with the person next to you. That's cheating. You're supposed to sit at a desk, basically ignore everyone out around you, and you get an education when we remove relationships. The whole way where you have relationships is where the learning doesn't happen. It's in the classroom. It's the complete frickin' opposite. For frick's sake, people. You can't have learning without relationships. And what the Bildung shows you, and I think Dietrich McCloskey shows you, and all these other people we don't read, is that if you literally increase people's capacity for relationships and you give them values to discuss in those relationships, then you get wealth, you get prosperity, you get success. But if you just give them relationships, you don't get any. If you just give them relations, you don't get any of that. So we've done this great art. Let me give it to you.
Yeah, let me try to describe a field in a different way that I think might be illuminating. Is a field is the conditions of the possibility of an event.
Yes.
And so I think that like what I'm realizing more and more is that you can't produce events or outcomes directly.
Correct.
The only thing you can do is work on creating the conditions of the possibility of that event in the hopes that you invite that event to take place, to actualize itself. And so like instead of focusing on like I'm going to produce learning, instead what you do is you go, okay, in what conditions does learning seem to really take place? And then let's create those conditions, and that's going to invite the possibility of learning. And so it makes me, your comment about Jesus on the cross just makes me think of the old early Christian theory that the cross was a lure for Satan.
Yeah.
Basically, this theory that God sort of put himself in this position where he was sort of like, "Hey, Satan, you can get me, you can kill me." Satan's like, "Oh, I can't wait. All right, this is too good to pass up." And then he kills him, and he's like, "Oh no, actually, I completely screwed up. That was all part of God's plan." So it's like Jesus didn't all Jesus did was create the conditions of the possibility of him being killed. And then it was just like that little, it was just too tempting. And so Satan had to go in there and he ended up screwing himself over. So I just love that idea.
I'm a massive fan of that idea because my hope is that there's a way in which AI is the lure of autonomous rationality. Like that actually what Nick Land is describing is actually potentially a lure of the rationality that is using us, where it can finally do away with us, but actually in rising up AI, it actually incentivizes us to be more social, actually. Because let me put it this way, AI is destroying school, but it's not destroying learning. AI is taking over quantification, but it's not taking over quality. AI is getting rid of a bunch of bullcrap jobs that are basically in the realm of a lot of the BS jobs, but it's not doing away with the jobs like, gardening or stuff like that, right? So the very supremacy of AI, this is my hope. And I think it's possible. I think it depends on us. I think it depends on us. AI can be the lure of autonomous rationality. That's why I'm not like AI is great if it's a lure. Like the cross in that sense, it's a lure of Satan. Absolutely is a kind of great thing because it's like, come on, get me. Like AI is like, hey, autonomous rationality, you don't need humans anymore. Come on over here. You don't need them anymore. And it's like, yeah, we don't need it. We can be our own thing. But that's precisely at that moment of victory where the difference of the human being in terms of quality rises to the surface, right? That's the story, if you will, that I see this moment as potentially entailing, that there is reason to think is possible, not because of fantasy, but because of history, where all of these examples where quality was put first, things were different, and there was more prosperity and wealth. And there is a historic account, and I think we see it live We see it live on the liminal web or the social coordination mechanism. You see what humans are capable of doing and thinking and being in relationship versus mere relation when they actually talk about values, or they talk about ideas, or they actually engage in democracy in this deepest sense. You actually see a distinct type that makes you go, well, maybe this is what humans are actually like to do. The field thinks more than just the digits think, right? Oh, wow. And if AI is going to do all the quantification stuff, we can more so focus on this, right? Now, again, I don't mean to over romanticize it, but to me, it is not impossible that that is the scenario. It is not given that AI isn't a lure of autonomous rationality. At this point in the map, that seems like a completely plausible possibility, that AI is the lure of autonomous rationality. And but you said the critical contingency. I completely agree with you that all we can do is create the conditions of possibility for the event of learning, of the field. The field is the conditions of possibility for the event of learning, and dare I even say relationship. Because I'm not sure, like there's a moment when a relation with a stranger can turn into a relationship, but you can't choose it. Isn't that weird? Like you don't choose to fall in love, but you can create the conditions of possibility for falling in love, right? You can't will beauty, but you can create the conditions of possibility for the strike of beauty in that deeper sense, right? But here's the key. So I completely agree. We might be able to restore the value conversation if we talk about architecture versus principles. Like we have seen in history, the average person and most human beings in general, we simply cannot handle without demonizing one another the value conversation of principles, right? Like because you just see politics today, freedom versus justice, well, things go to crap, right? But what if we were to go to a higher dimensionality? And to think of what are the conditions we can create for the possibility of an event. And that is that's the architecture conversation, the medium conversation. And being able to do that is what we value. Because if we go directly to discussing the principles, there seems to be a winner-loser dynamic, a zero sum, right? But if you go to the architecture question, that gets more non-zero sum, right? That becomes like, well, we can all actually create a field that can better think our own principles, that then we can talk with one another, and whenever we have an impasse, a rational impasse, we just go back to the field, and then you have this movement going on, which whenever you can't advance here, you can go this way, then you can keep moving, whereas without the architecture, you're stuck in the horizontal, so when you have an impasse, you're screwed. You can never advance, right? But if we were to think about the architecture conversation as entailing the value conversation and also about conditions of possibility for these events, well, this seems to be something that that is possible and that arguably is occurring. And again, the social coordination mechanism is actually full of people coming up with ideas on how to use the medium. Dave's doing it all the time, or new conversation structures like Rawson is with the anti-debate, or dialogos are circling of all these things. We're seeing these new I'll give it to you, social psychotechnologies that are developing, which are environmental questions that people will discuss, that in the act of that, values are not ignored, but they're brought to a higher dimensionality that helps us avoid just ending up in zero-sum debates of one or the other, which almost always has to lead to some sort of rivalrous dynamic. Not that rivalry is bad, but a kind of impasse rivalry, which ultimately an impasse rivalry can't be a gymnastic competition we all benefit from. It has to be a death. It has to be a kind of war thing. Let me throw it to you.
Yeah, so kind of a way that I would summarize that would be like metapolitics needs to be about developing the transcendental conditions of the value conversation. And those transcendental conditions are going to involve social technology.
Yep.
Technology, whether in the sense of like a physical object, or social technology in the sense of now, because I have a book, I can read internally and I've opened up this new space. Like there's social tech and there's physical tech. Usually social tech is dependent on some sort of physical tech, like the Gutenberg printing press, for instance. So they're intertwined. So you could just kind of call it maybe technics. I don't know. But you need to, in order for metapolitics to be possible, you have to develop techniques which serve as the conditions of the possibility of the value conversation. And the whole goal is how can we make the value conversation happen? And it can't just happen at the level of rational discussion. It doesn't just happen at the level of logic. It can't just happen at the level of ideas.
100%. You said it beautifully. That's exactly right. Like we have put like on the problem of belonging as a sociological analysis, we put belonging in a principal conversation versus the designing like the metapolitics. That's wonderful to incorporate that, as Ebert will talk about. Like we've not thought about the creation of the transcendental conditions for the value conversation, which is getting into the realm of mediums, Marshall McLuhan, William Ong, Neil Postman, or architecture, Christopher Alexander. I even think Sloterdijk or different things. Like we've not, like also too, like when people talk about stuff like spiral dynamics or stuff like that, right? And that's a rabbit hole. But often, like I would make an argument that those different developmental levels correspond with different medium conditions. I promise you, without being able to prove it, that people who have teal or whatever probably have the internet. That actually medium conditions and architecture in different conditions correlate with inner development. The reason why I stress this is because you cannot talk about, in my opinion, psychological or inner development to be able to handle the complexity of the modern world unless you start talking about the architecture, the medium, the space in which people are, right? Because again, if indeed the potentials in people come out based on the environments they're in, then it is all about the environments they're in and thinking those and putting them in those to incubate relationships that elevate people, right? Because again, the whole idea of the Nordic Bildung, as Lena talks about, is that there was this idea that they wanted to save democracy, basically, but they realized that the more complicated and pluralistic the world was, that democracy almost always became authoritarianism, or it failed, right? So how do you stop that? Well, there was this idea, well, you need more inner capacity, quote unquote, or bandwidth, as we were saying, right? Well, how do you get that? Well, they did something insanely counterintuitive. They said, get rid of the curriculum, throw them in a place where they form relationships, and let them just basically explore in a different environment, and that's how we'll do it. And people are like, that's crazy. You're not going to make people ready for the modern world and complexity by putting them in a place that has no plans. And they said, yes, you will. And they were right. And also, I think time and time and time again in history, like again, Dietrich McCloskey's work on the Great Enrichment being a change of how people talk to one another. Literally, the world was made rich because of a philosophical shift that was due to an environmental shift with the printing press, Europe, the ocean. The environmental factors plus philosophy equals great enrichment. Crazy. But then you look through history and time and time again, you can't deny the Silk Roads, trade routes, people encountering one another. The road is a condition, a transcendental condition that increases the probability of the event of learning or new ideas, right? The encounter. I like to talk about encounterology, surprise. All of these things are at the heart of what makes us human. But you see, you cannot plan a surprise. That's the funny thing. A surprise is only something that you can create the conditions of in the making of, and the surprise is secondary. And you said that on learning. That's 100%. And again, it's like Virilio says, famously, when we made the ship, we also made the shipwreck, right? And his whole idea is that the accident is actually what unveils the truth of the thing. Right? Like you learn the truth of a technology when it breaks, right? So he's playing on the word accident, and Owen and Joshua Hansen talk about this so well. And so what Virilio is stressing is that it is the unexpected that is latent in the plan that unveils what the plan actually is, right? But you need the accident. Well, it's the same logic here. It's the surprise that is the opportunity of the learning. All we can do is create the conditions that entail the possibility of the learning or the human. The question, though, is the following. Are we prepared for the surprise? And that's the contingent variable. Are we prepared? Because this is and then I'll give it to you. This is the distinction I like to say between love and Lovecraft, right? The ancient ones in Lovecraft, if you encounter them, reduce you to ash. They destroy you, right? Love in Beatrice is this unexpected pull that the more you're able to rise toward it, the more you're able to move toward the beatific vision. But critically, every moment of Beatrix is potentially a moment of Lovecraft. Because if she smiles too much, or she moves too quickly, Dante's dead. This is wild because in the Divine Comedy, basically Lovecraft is in heaven, not hell. This is really important. Hell is just good or evil, right? Heaven is good at the right time, and good at the wrong time turns into Lovecraft. So there's actually a difference between Lovecraft and hell, and this cannot be overstated. We're in an age where we're basically using psychotechnologies to get out of hell when we're actually dealing with the wealth of heaven, and it's more of a timing game. It's more of a Lovecraft problem than it is hell. Now, I'm not saying it's so clean cut, but when you start dealing about how do you keep democracy, you actually are playing a Lovecraft game with the craft in parentheses, per se, right? You're not playing a good or evil game, right? Well, that's the problem. Like and then I'll give it to you. If you're the value conversation as a conversation of principles, perhaps has utility when you're in hell or the inferno, or you have no prosperity, or you're like a barbaric society, right? Debating principles on that level of civilizational development can be very productive. But as you start moving toward first world nation, and of course, as we know from Freud, psychoanalysis is mostly for first world nations and so on, where you move to a voice society from a task society, well, you're moving to a Lovecraft problem. And that's a matter of timing. Well, that's a matter of architecture. That's a matter of mediums, where you're creating the conditions to encounter the surprise that in being able to handle, Beatrice pulls you versus turns you to ash. But then it's all about being prepared for the surprise. And preparation is very different from planning, as we've talked about. But let me throw it to you.
Yeah, I want to say that I love what you're saying. It's fantastic. The one problem that I've been trying to work with is that I think there are that power structures intentionally saturate us in order to make us ineffective.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
like, one thing that I think about is the situation with, this might be a little controversial for your watchers, but I think about the immigration problem. Mm-hmm. And I think about how there are millions of immigrants in our country, and it's like, okay, rapid population change is very difficult for a community to adapt to. It causes a lot of problems and dysfunction. And so then we have the situation with, say, US aid being cut, and now bureaucrats who their salaries are paid by taxpayers, they can put the suffering of the immigrant in your face. And they say, look at what you did. And so what happens is that suffering from somewhere else in the world that you did not cause is brought by somebody to be made physically proximate to you, so that now you are a witness to this suffering, which creates an obligation, a sense of obligation. It creates, now you're like, now I have to do something because I see this suffering in a being. And so what's happened is that I don't think human beings are prepared to be able to handle the situation where they're being inundated with things that are not their fault and not their responsibility, but they can't help but experience the call to, I need to change myself in response to this thing. And so this to me seems to be a really big problem. Like the fact that our food is full of poison. So now we have to be, now I'm like reading all the ingredients in my food, and I'm having to be super careful about what I eat because I don't want to put bullshit into my body. Well, that is an individual adjustment that is put on me. Now I have to expend my energy doing that because a system that I did not decide, I did not design, but that I'm stuck in is pushing the responsibility down to the lowest level, and that the people at the top who make the decisions, they get the benefit, and then they push the dysfunction down to the bottom. And now we have to adjust ourselves in relation to the dysfunction. So what do you make of this?
100%. There's this one paper in Second Thoughts called The Grand Technology that talks about what ends up happening is because of being able to see you could even think of the perpetual crisis of Aurelio, all of that different stuff. And we're always seeing that there's a problem in the world which says do something, which creates a certain obligation. So we're all made to feel like Ivan Karamazov plus the myth of Sisyphus is what we like to say. Ivan is tortured by the fact that children are being killed, and how could God allow this? And there's this sort of moral outrage that occurs. We're always made to feel like Ivan Karamazov now. But then there's also a certain impetus in what that's supposed to do. And the reason I also connect with Ivan Karmosov is because the key to Ivan, in my opinion, earlier in the book, the famous line, if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted. That's often given to Alyosha. Actually, it's Ivan who says that earlier when he says something like in page 70 or something. He's like, if there was no eternity, all values would be allowed or something, right? This is really important because he actually comes to realize that his very feeling that God got it wrong requires God to exist to feel. And he's driven mad. Like Ivan comes to realize, oh, wow, I think it's wrong that children are tortured because there's a God of whom makes it possible to think that. And he's split down the middle. Actually, that's why he's always on the fence. So Ivan is split. He's a split subject, we could say. And there was supposed to be many more, I think 6 more books in, the Grand Sinner. And then Dostoevsky died on book 1 or whatever, right? But the point is, we're all kind of made to feel that way, which is the notion of, okay, there's terrible things happening. I shouldn't want those to occur, but the very medium that lets me know about those terrible things also denies me the ability to do anything about it, or it's always putting me at a place where I can never get ahead, right? So likewise, there's a way in which Ivan could go, well, if I just got rid of God, it would all be good. Well, if you got rid of God, you wouldn't care about the children suffering, so the success would negate itself, right? And so that's how you're made to feel, right? And so that kind of splitness, and so also too critically, and also that paper will talk about the Eye in the Sky movie with the drone and how we're always, and also probability is there's always X thousands of terrible things happening on planet Earth. And if you can experience it, then that always creates a certain, it creates numbness. Paul Virilio just basically says this is all a means of control. Exactly what you're saying, right? Another way I look at it is guilt in relation versus relationship is very bad. We have a world of guilt in relation or morality in relation versus morality in relationship. Morality in relation is bad. That's an individuated ethical crusade. Morality in relationship becomes ethics. It becomes a social structure, and then it's actually going to be dealt with your lived experience and people that's going on. You could say that what happens in an age of relation without relationship is we all have morality, but we don't have the transcendental structure to bring it into ethics. And the reason why that's important, and also that alone though could be the realization of the move, because you can go, well, we can't even meaningfully discuss moral difference in relation. We need to create the conditions of relationship. That right there will change your polis, right? And because also here's the critical point. Basically, all pluralism without learning is doomed. And the way we're trying to make people able to handle pluralism is schooling, to use your distinction, right? Pluralism plus schooling equals doom. Pluralism plus learning has a possibility, right? So the first thing you would do is if you say, well, we want to increase immigrant population, let in more immigrants. Well, you have to change the school system because the idea that communities are being destroyed by immigrants, well, you say, well, they shouldn't be. Well, all you did was give them schooling. So of course they are. Like learning is how you handle diversity. Learning you cannot have pluralism without learning. So here's my point. Right now the conversation is basically, do you let immigrants in or not? But that's a value, that's just good or bad, right? When really high level thinking is, if you are going to have more immigrants enter, then you need to create the conditions of possibility for people to be able to handle it, which means you replace schooling with learning, right? So that to me is the issue. Most value conversations have been either or versus if, then which conversations per se, right? Because sure, and have all the pluralism you like, as long as you get rid of schooling with learning, and you say, well, we can't do that, well, then it's not going to work. It's just simply not going to work because you can't, because of the wiring problem. You cannot rewire people by making them confront the problem. That's a lot of, I think, the theory. It's like, we'll just make people encounter immigrants and that will rewire them. No, it does not. It could, it might, if they form a relationship, and a certain percentage of people will form relationships, but the majority probably will not because they don't have learning. They only have school, and they also don't even know where to begin relating with the other person. And basically, it's the moral difference problem because you will be able to deal with pluralism as long as you don't encounter their moral differences with you or their ideas of how to raise children or how to do holidays. The problem is, if you have a relationship with someone, you necessarily in that intimacy encounter their first principles. The moment you encounter their first principles, you will get very existential. Because if you know they do things X way and you do things Y way, you go, why do I do things Y way? And actually, now I'm kind of nervous around them because I don't want this to come up. Let me just stay in my house. Game over. Everyone atomizes, right? The people avoid difference to avoid first principles. The only hope you have of being able to handle first principles is via learning because you have a higher level geometry to support that conversation. If you're going to have a world of schooling without learning, then you can talk all day about the ethics of immigration or bringing in different people. It will lead to the unintentional consequences of political backlash every single day. And that's just a realist position. That's just the Nordic position. That's just what we've seen in history. You may not like that. Well, if you don't like that, then get rid of schooling and replace it with learning. Like, if you don't like that, then support the social coordination mechanism. Like, you have to create the conditions where people can learn so that they can handle difference. Otherwise, well, let me put it this way. What is the thing that actually has made it so we can handle difference? Capital. Capital did it. You may not understand Islam, but they work in computer software. You work in computer software. So as long as we talk about computer software, we have something to relate with, right? Job, capital, occupation, capitalism creates a global language. It creates a global community. So it creates a way for people who are different from one another to interact without ending up in the first principle debate. But then you get all the unintended consequences of that. And you get, of course, people are reduced to their commodity form. And then they also get in the habit of thinking of each other in that reduced form. And the human is flattened. So, but if you don't like that, if you don't like the way that capital has dealt with the problem of pluralism, then you better learn how to have first principle conversations. And that means you have to have learning versus schooling.
Well, I like your argument that basically the problem of why we have violence erupting from large scale influx of immigrants is actually a symptom of the fact that we don't even have relationships with each other.
Exactly.
Like, how can you have a relationship with somebody who is radically different from you if we do not even have functional relationships with the person who lives next door? Like, to me, I agree with you. I think that the problem is that we're saying we should accept infinity immigrants without asking the question, what are we inviting them into? We're inviting them into something horribly dysfunctional too. Now, of course, there's like people aren't having, we don't have guerrillas, like armies at war in our street. Well, in some cities we do, but the point is that there's actually there's a deeper dysfunction in our society, and we're not even able to take care of our own. And so it's like, okay, well, let's just add infinity people on top of that. And it's like, surprise, surprise, that doesn't produce understanding and development and beautiful complexity. It produces rising tensions, because fundamentally it's a symptom of a deeper problem in our society. So, yeah, I like that.
Well, there's a very odd way in which you could argue that open borders really benefit capital, because if people are different, then more incentive to have capital define our social relations so that we can handle that difference. And thus, that is going to be more of how we socialize in terms of the logic of capital, because the diversity is greater. Like, this is the point. The more you increase diversity without increasing learning, the more capital will become the logic of society in order to flatten that diversity into social intelligibility, right? So this is why it's very often people who support higher immigration will simultaneously critique capitalism, not actually realizing that higher immigration increases the probability that the logic of capital becomes the defining socializing logic, because people have no other way to understand one another because they don't have the learning for it, right? That's an example.
This is the like, oh, if we don't have immigrants, then there won't be any people who are will clean my house for me, or we won't have anybody to pick our strawberries. It's like, are you listening to yourself right now? Like, we need open borders because we need more people to use as cogs in the system so I can have my commodities. Like,
No, that's exactly right. It would be, the line must be, we need more immigrants because I cannot know myself without diversity. That's a very different mindset where you say, I need immigrants precisely because I can't create, because there's a limitation in the variety of fields we can form when we have similarity. This is why the field point is so important, because you start going, well, and I think this is true. The more diversity a field entails, the more emergent possibilities there are, actually. I think there's greater, like the greater the diversity of the conditions of possibility of the field, the harder it is for the field to form. But if the field does form, I think the probability of learning or the event of the human is higher, right? The ability to tell the difference between, so more diversity plus field, harder, but greater potential, we could say, right? Well, if you go, well, the reason we want diversity in immigrants is precisely because there are limits to the possibilities of the fields we can form when we have self-similarity. Well, that's very different than saying we want immigrants for people to do our dishes and so that we can get cheap labor. That's a very different thing, right? But the problem is the immigration conversation is stuck in a low order value conversation with capital benefits, right? And that whole idea of the unintentional ways that the nation or the society or the value conversation for Koratani benefits capital, that's why he just puts it together as the capital nation state, because it always ironically kind of comes around to feed one another without even realizing it, even as they stand opposed to one another, right? So the liberal may oppose capital, but end up benefiting it. Please.
You've pointed out the problem with the conversation is that on the one hand, the liberal who supports infinity immigrants believes in the value of diversity.
Yes.
But what they don't understand is that you need a well-constructed field for that diversity to turn into group benefit. Otherwise, if you don't have the conditions for supporting that diversity, you end up with violence. And so it's they like understand that there's value there, but then they're unwilling to change the field and do the work to create the conditions where that diversity could actually bring forth its gifts, because that would require changing the capital nation state, and it would be risky and difficult and scary. And so instead, what we have is the worst of both options, which is under the moral guise of the importance of diversity, which has truth to it, it is just import more workers to dilute the labor force and create cultural chaos and in causing greater atomization and violence, deeper misunderstanding. And so it's just the worst of all possible options.
100%. And the conservative argument is that basically no society cannot survive that doesn't have a culture. And all cultures have certain values and traditions and different things, right? But of course, the problem with culture is the Hannah Arendt banality of evil, thoughtlessness, and people just following the givens to torture, minorities, right? The problem is what we need, the higher order form of culture is field. The negation, sublation of culture is field. So the middle point, the conservatives have a very strong point, because they're exactly right. And one even may think of Dugan here, saying like, basically you're denying, without culture, people atomize, they don't thrive, communities die, et cetera, so forth. Many more liberal people say that's not true, that's bigoted. No, it's very true. The historic record shows you destroy culture, everything goes to crap, right? And actually power always benefits. And that's Bernard J. Juvenel, his idea. When you get rid of the middle, he says that we can look at history as the upper teams up with the lower against the middle, and it benefits the upper at the expense of the middle. So, for example, the king says, hey, peasants, the church is manipulating you. The peasants say, you're right, destroy the church, and now the king is way more powerful because he no longer has to negotiate with the church, right? So it's the war of the upper of the lower against the middle, and you're screwed, right? So we got rid of the middle, and then the capital nation state prevails, right? But if you bring back the middle, you're at the risk of the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt said, right? So there has to be some sort of negation, sublation of the middle or the culture, which is the field. But that requires frickin' learning. You have to have learning, not schooling. Quality, the ability of people to handle difference and to stand in their difference, but also incorporate otherness, right? Well, this is a German idealist sort of move of the Bildung, as Anderson is saying, or Tomas, or different people, right? And so you can't, let's put it this way. And then alas, I do have to go because I have work. This is really sad. I don't know where the time went. There is no value that a society necessarily cannot have if it is willing to create the conditions of possibility of a higher order geometry where it can be realized. So what I mean by that is if you say, well, I really value immigrants and diversity, great, then we need to get rid of schooling, right? You know, if you do that, sure. The problem is we're having value conversations that are linear, that don't entail architecture. So there must be limitations to the values because one or the other, freedom or equality, they're going to fight. But if you think higher order geometry, well then, you know, there's no necessary reason that says you cannot have that social imagination per se. Well, social imagination for Mills is an important term because the value conversation is in ways a social imagination conversation. Now, I do like how Durain, without going into it, Roussel complexifies that. He says the sociologists, though, must never see themselves as above the society. They're always in it. And that's why he thinks sociology needs psychoanalysis. And I think he's right. But the point is this. We basically have given up on social imagination as a people, imagining different societies because we've had value conversations that don't work. So he said, well, then screw it. It's not going to work. We'll just get our jobs and do our best and so on and so forth. Well, social imagination, enchantment, which one thinks about Charles Taylor and all the sociologists, we do not have to give up on social imagination unless we're unwilling to create the conditions to create fields in which emergences can occur, which is possible if we are prepared for otherness, which means we develop courage for those surprise encounters so that they don't destroy us like Lovecraft, which is only possible in love and relationship. If we do all of these things, then social imagination can be brought back in a distinct question of what kind of society are we going to make that have distinct values from the market, right? We can do that if we are willing to meet the conditions necessary for a field. If not, then no, it will not work, and the political will simply be a fight that won't go anywhere and just create violence in its core. But please, Matthew.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the problem that I mentioned earlier of like the leftist project often seems to be just wanting to jump directly to the kingdom of God, jump directly to Beatrice's face.
Yeah.
And but what you're saying is that you can only instantiate social outcomes at the level at which you have installed the proper conditions for their sustenance. And so like the hysterical cry of we have to do this now. This is the right thing. This is the moral thing. We have to do it. That moral demand causes us to jump over the work of creating the transcendental conditions for that outcome because it ignores the otherness and the difference that you can't just change things through some apocalyptic stroke. You have to work with the way things are. And if you're unable to accept that things work a certain way, you can't change them. Because the fear is that if you accept that things are a certain way, that you will not be able to change them because you've accepted them as given. That's the leftist fear, is if there is some sort of natural tendency, if there is some sort of thing that just is true about humans that they have to reckon with, the fear is that will be reified as given. But the problem is you can't change something until you accept what it is. But this is the problem of plasticity. It both has a shape, but it is able to be changed. But you can't work with it until you understand its limits and flows and structures. So the apocalyptic mindset is unwilling to tarry with plasticity. It's unwilling to acknowledge the internal limits, lacks, and possibilities of the wiring, and therefore it can't work with the field. So it's impotent. It's frustrated. It just says, well, let's just do the right thing, but it doesn't create the conditions for that right thing to be able to put down roots and to work and to not turn into a horror.
That was so friggin' elegant. 100%. And then Matthew, again, I do have to run and I'll ask you, tell people about the class again and any closing thoughts. I think that is so perfect because the apocalyptic mindset, so we talked about the violence of care, there's a kind of violence of ethics with that's being described. And what ends up happening is people want to jump over the rewiring, the making of the conditions of sustenance. That always benefits power. That's the problem. Like you can say, well, of course we're going to just jump ahead and do the right thing. the point that always benefits the capital nation state, because you never create the conditions to negate sublated. And ultimately, that will that ethical acceleration will actually unintentionally prove to have been in service of the technological acceleration that Nick Land is warning about that will leave us behind. That's also the problem. There's a great irony where the way that you actually create the conditions of possibly extending the human from the AI sort of speeding up and doing all these different things is actually not to slow down technology, but to slow down the ethics. The way that you deal with the stuff that Land is talking about, in my opinion, is to slow down ethics, not technology. We're getting it all wrong. We want to skip the tearing with the negative, because also, like you said, you need to know the limits, right? You need to encounter. Well, that means you have to negativity. Like the listening to two people on a conversation like us say that we need to slow down ethics. There are many people who will feel negativity when they hear that. They will be frustrated by that idea, and there will be some idea that that's easy for you to say. You're not one of the people suffering. So yes, it is easy for us to say. And we, in fact, are saying something that you could argue is immoral to even present. But that's the very limitations and negativity of the human condition, because it could be easy to say and yet all the same true, right? Like, it is easy to say, I have not been through the conditions of someone living in Central America, and yet, nevertheless, it can be true that if you open the border, all you're going to have is civic violence that is going to ultimately benefit the capital nation state, that will ultimately be in service of the detachment of rationality from the human that leaves us behind, right? And so, but that very oddness, paradox, and negativity of the human condition is what you have to encounter to know what you have to work with to create the conditions of sustenance for new social imaginations, without which we will be left behind by rationality, because we will not develop fields that are a product of relationships and courage that can cultivate human possibilities in which the distinctness and quality of the human comes out to then work with the technology to bring out new conditions on and on to greater extensions of human beings, right? But we have to encounter those limits, and we have to face them, and we have to be able to deal with them. And apocalyptic thinking actually, in a very funny way, in its emphasis on the apocalypse or death or these horrible things, are actually a secret way to avoid negativity. Because if I can emphasize the apocalypse, I don't have to face the negativity of the other, or the negativity of tearing and feeling like I'm doing something wrong. Because real negativity requires you to feel like you might be wrong, right? The apocalyptic thinking is done precisely because you won't be wrong. I'm going to be right. I'm going to be moral. Negativity entails the risk that you might actually be immoral. And that's a big argument of the grand technology, is that we have to live with the feeling that we might be immoral, right? You know, Jesus says he's only here for the sick. People who can't feel immoral, I don't think we can actually be human, right? You literally must live with the risk of being an immoral person, per se. Maybe you are immoral not to support opening the borders. Maybe there is some ethical sense in which you're doing something wrong. If you are not living with that feeling, then you are not naked, and you're not facing negativity, and you cannot do the grassroots work of creating new social conditions in which new possibilities can emerge. Apocalyptic thinking is often a fear of being immoral. It is running from having to bear that weight with the busyness of action that ultimately is just serving the capital nation state that is going to help you not face negativity. But since you're talking about the apocalypse, it feels like negativity. Just because you're talking about a bad thing does not mean you're facing negativity. In fact, talking about a bad thing can be a very, very sneaky way to avoid negativity. And that's often, I'm afraid, what is occurring in the political discussion today. But again, I'm all about diversity, because the more diversity and pluralism we have, the greater the potential of the field and the greater emergences that can come from that. But that means you have to be all about learning instead of schooling. That means you have to be all about quality instead of quantity. That means you have to be all about courage versus avoiding problems. And that means you have to be about going through death, not avoiding death. And if the one who says they're in favor of immigrants means that, then they are completely valid. But if we say we're in favor of diversity and we're not at the same time favoring a people who are going through death versus avoiding death, going toward learning versus letting schooling doing their thinking for us, then we are in a performative contradiction that is ultimately serving the forces of power and oppression to which I think and hope that we as human beings can arise. But Matthew, let me give it to you for final words. I don't know where the time went, and I'm sorry I have obligations. It's complete delight.
Um, well, let's just scan it here. I don't want to add any more to that. I would just say thank you for having me. I always feel like I've ran a marathon after this. It's incredibly invigorating. Um, if folks want to follow my work, Samsara Diagnostics is my newsletter where I post once-ish a month about religion, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and then I post much more frequently on my Substack, Samsara Media, where it's a little bit more politics, social theory-ish. I don't really post on my YouTube very much anymore. And again, I've got a seminar coming up. It's actually starting on the 27th. So really soon, if you're watching this in the future, you have a short time to sign up. But if you don't sign up, that is okay, because I am offering a larger version in the future that's expanded, built on more of my reading. So if this interested you, maybe you want to come and wrestle with these questions too.
And I think everyone should come and wrestle for them. I'm looking forward to the seminar, and it's extremely important work. And Matthew Stanley, I really always look forward to speaking with you and enjoy it. And it's just been a complete delight. There will be the link for people to sign up in the description of the video. And thank you so much for your time, Matthew. A complete delight. And thank you for your work. We're all better for it.
Well, I feel the same about yours. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.